All right. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like live right here on Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. As always, please get to all the business of liking and sharing and subscribing. Make sure you hit the all when you hit the bell, hit the all so you don't miss any of the updates to Black Power Media. And so many are coming, from the lives to the new shows to the Remix morning show, which starts tomorrow morning, to there's just so many different things happening. Some of it scheduled, some of it not, some of it impromptu, some of it planned out. So you don't want to miss any of it. And so make sure you hit the all on the bell when you subscribe. And then if you can, join so that your membership can go to help expand the channel. Just spoke to another potential group to join. You know, we do have a new process for intake of all the help and shows. So I've invited them to go through that so that we can, but my point is we might even have more coming in the weeks ahead. So, and what's interesting, you know what I really love about what happened over the last few days is that can't give any more details, unfortunately, right now, at least. But I will say this much: two somewhat different formations of African people looking for revolutionary change have a disagreement. Both quote unquote sides, and they're not really sides. I'm not trying to suggest any real hostility or sides. And in fact, they're both on the same side. But both have approached me and us here at Black Power Media. Both have looked to have us play some sort of positive role in presenting each of their arguments and then potentially hosting a discussion with both of them. And both, independent of one another, inquired about their individual or independent formation, engagement, or participation with Black Power Media. So we'll see. And that's exactly, for me at least, what I think is so important about what we're trying to do here. The collective we're trying to build, the public sphere we're trying to build. It's not uniform. It's not, there is diversity within Black radical politics, or within the traditional of radical Blackness. Shout out again to CBS. So, anyway, I just thought it worked out beautifully. And in speaking with one of the potential participants or whatever I'm talking about here, again, just this morning, it was beautiful. And I can't wait to be able to share more publicly, because as I'm encouraging, more should be public about how principled and responsible this relative disagreement has been handled, or is being handled, by at least some parties. So, and that's something that I was saying to one of them today. Why, at least partially selfishly, I wanted to host the discussion here, or somewhere on this platform, is because, and not just because I would want to view that as an independent, consumer of media, but I would want to help promote this as the style for principled engagement when there is disagreement. Anyway, so that worked out well. All right. First of all, thanks, John. Welcome to becoming a new member. Definitely welcome, McYagermeister. Definitely hit the like button. We want you to definitely whatever it is, help with the algorithm. The more likes, the more people end up seeing the video. The whatever, how the algorithm works, all of that. So anyway, but that was something that I was pretty happy to to see happening, even if I can't share much more of that publicly today. At 12:30, in just about 20 minutes or so, we're going to have members of the national, I keep getting it wrong, so I had to pull it up in front of me, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC group, with whom I played a very small role in the development of this paper that we're going to discuss in great detail, Black Entrepreneurship's Lethal Pre-Existing Condition, the Racial Wealth Divide During the COVID Crisis. I'm very excited to have them come on here to not only talk about the details of what's in that report, but a little bit about, I think, some of the methodology involved, which I think is important as well. Then at 2 p.m., one of our co-founders here, Black Power Media, Kamau Franklin, is going to come on to talk not only about that, but more specifically about his work in the other wing, or another wing of his work, community movement builders, which, if you heard discussed when he was interviewed a couple of weeks ago by Dr. CBS on The Last Dope Intellectual, there's some fascinating details to share, but I also want to get him to give us an update on the Fridge Lady. And if you didn't catch CBS's Last Dope Intellectual and don't get what I'm referring to, or aren't familiar with community movement builders, you don't want to miss this. That's going to come up in a couple hours at 2:00 Eastern Standard Time today. Now, and before I move on just a little bit, there are a couple of things I wanted other things I wanted to bring up and announce as coming up here on this platform, or on this particular show, I Mix What I Like Live. But by the way, so I really hope you all watched the interview we did, speaking of somewhat impromptu stuff, the interview we did Saturday morning with Kalanji Changa, another co-founder here at Black Power Media, co-host with Kamau Franklin of Renegade Culture. But if you heard in that interview, or if you haven't, go check it out, because he has done and is doing so much more. I don't think we had ever, I was trying to think, I don't think we had ever really sat down for an actual interview like that about his work. Historically, whenever it would just be something specific. When I was doing radio about something he was involved in, probably connected to Daruba or something like that. But so having known a little bit about his work, I thought it would be a great conversation. I was right. So you definitely want to go check that out if you haven't seen it. A conversation with the Riot Starter. We really didn't even get into that name. We have to do a part 2 about why he has that name as a anyway. But also all the stuff that happened. First of all, Sunday night at 8:00. I hope you all saw Sundays with the Ear Doctor. The man can spin. Did a little tribute to Nas, was dope. So every Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, the Ear Doctor is going to be spinning, and he did a great job again this past weekend. And of course, Friday with that lineup was heavy hitting, especially since all of it contained Lukman Nation. Lukman Nation at 5, Last Dope Intellectual at 7, Renegade Culture at 9 Eastern. It was certainly a dope Friday, so I hope you all were there live for it, or will come back and at least check out the replays. Couple of other things here before our guests show up on Monday. So well, not on Monday. So on Friday this week, I'm adding again to the Dope Fridays lineup, because schedules worked out that I would be able to get the co-authors of this new book who are going to be joining me Friday, and it's a very interesting read, particularly Dr. Relina Joseph. If anybody's interested, go to imixwhatilike.org. We have a number of interviews about her work on critical mixed race studies, and frankly, she doesn't like to talk about it that much, but she wrote an article for Black Scholar years ago, which is how I was introduced to her work. Back when Sundiata Chajua was the editor, and I am still on the what is it, is it the reviewers or I forgot the exact whatever, but whose Real Talk show, by the way, is dope too. I hope you're all catching that too. Dr. Sundiata Chajiwa, Real Talk. But he published, or the journal published, even when he published, the journal had published an essay, a critique of, it was really a critique of the 90s boom of mixed race studies biographies, that really academically and intellectually spoke to my own views on the subject. I did send them an email this morning because I think there's going to be a nice positive disagreement with where I think they're headed. I got to try to finish more, obviously, by Friday. But I sent them an email this morning because, well, the first part that I think is really important that they say here, we're going to get into this on Friday, is that they say, this is something I've actually always thought about. We'll get into what the complications are that they're talking about, but these complications come about not because of an intrinsic sense of confusion inside of multiracial kids. Rather, mixed race kids, or to use the nomenclature of this book's title, generation mixed kids, experience a monoracial or single race world that is confused about mixed race. So they say that, I hope I understand that right, because they say that in a way I've better than I would have put it, but something I've been thinking for a long time. Everybody's always talking about mixed folks are confused, at least not in all cases. A lot of times a monoracial world causes confusion among those in that world about mixed race. And in that sort of collision is often dismissed as, tragic mulatto, or the mixed kid is confused, or whatever. Not necessarily. My point is everybody's confused in this joint, or the joint is confusing, and some get in all groups or whatever definitions get caught up in variations of it. So that was one thing, but that's not the controversy. Well, that's not the point of potential disagreement. Here's what I asked, and then I sent them, Brother Netfa Freeman invited me on a couple weeks ago or days ago to talk about my views of this. And I admitted to them mine are unscientific. So I'm inviting my guests on Friday. I sent them the link and I said, please, if you get a chance, listen to what I had to say. And hopefully you'll be able to say, or I'll know by then, how your book corrects, or challenges, or, corrects my argument or whatever. Because it might, I don't know. But what they write here, talking about the show Mixtish, because my argument was that Mixtish was an unrealistic, but I didn't watch the whole season. So they talk about they chart the trajectory of the entire season. So that's again why my argument was not scientific. Their argument is, well, I was simply saying that Mixtish as the TV show was presenting an unrealistic fantasy, a deracialized, depoliticized fantasy of a mixed race family that also includes a white stepfather, Reaganite, who's welcomed and sort of a comic relief character, which really turned me off. I have to admit that too. Like, because in my household, Reagan was the devil. Like Huey in the Boondocks said, Ronald Reagan is the devil. Or who was, or maybe that's not, or maybe whatever. But in our household growing up, that he was. So, and he died during my wedding. Anyway, but they say something very interesting here. Despite the awkwardness of how the show handles race, the primetime showing of Mixtish feels in some ways to these Generation X authors nothing short of revolutionary. Mixed race is now common enough to enter into the ultimate hallmark of mainstream Americana sitcoms. So I said to them, you all are calling it revolutionary. I'm calling it anti-Black and colonial or imperial or neo-colonial. So I'm very interested to know to keep reading and see how they make that argument, and to see maybe it'll change mine. I did not admit that, and then I'll try to also to quickly watch the rest of the this week, the rest of that season, to see if I can at least be more prepared for Friday's show. So that'll be Friday morning here at I Mix What I Like Live, a discussion with the authors of Generation Mixed Goes to School. It's also going to be interesting to see, because they described that their method includes, like, they're talking to Generation Z. Those are the people that they interviewed, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a look at, so me being Generation X, like the authors, it'll be interesting to see not only what younger people are reported to be saying here, but also the differences in how we as Generation Xers may be interpreting it. I can't find the exact part where they said, yeah, I'm pretty sure that was what they were saying. Who we interviewed was a whole section here. And anyway, so that, but we'll get into that on Friday. Looking forward to that very much. And I do encourage people to go back and look at our previous interviews with Dr. Joseph. Very interesting, very interesting. So the other thing, I didn't want to try to rush to do it today, but I was very much tempted to, because there's something else I'm hoping will be dealt with variously, either on this show and or on other shows on this platform. But somebody, it was brought to my attention of this interview, and I did watch the entire interview with Mark Lamont Hill and Patrice Cullors on the Black News Channel. So I was thinking it'd be interesting to get into their content more and see, the differences between the Black News Channel and Black Power Media. But I did watch this entire interview with Mark Lamont Hill, an exclusive with Patrice Cullors. It's in several parts, where she is asked. Look, frankly, I found it to be a skillfully but poorly done. So this is going to be interesting, because I don't know, it's just interesting. I often find myself in agreement with Mark Lamont Hill. I appreciate it at times, the position he finds himself in. But on this one, we can't agree. I appreciate that he invited me on to a discussion with Barbara Ransby the other day about reparations, which is out. And I was hoping to have her come on, but I don't know. We might have to do something about this. So there's so many interesting things happening here and overlaps, but I just thought this interview was just very poorly done. And it primarily because it frames the question of criticism of Patrice Cullors as strictly white supremacist and right wing. And it only highlights the criticism coming from, like the New York Post or something like that, and didn't discuss at all the criticisms of Black people, Black women in particular, working within Black communities, as attempting to within Black Lives Matter, who had their own set of criticisms. We, of course, hosted 4 of those women here, members of the Black Lives Matter 10. That's obviously on the channel. Luke Ma Nation hosted, I'm forgetting the exact formations they were coming out of, but other, if I'm not mistaken, they were all Black women too, coming out of various formations around the country of Black Lives Matter, who had their critique. They ignored the statement of the Black Lives Matter 10. They ignored the statement that came out from the other group out of Washington and California. What was that? I forgot the other formation. They ignored all of that and presented it as though public criticism of Patrice Cullors is anti-Black, white supremacist, and contradicting the movement. And I found that to be terribly disingenuous. And so none of those questions were dealt with. She dismissed the expenditure of the $90 million as something still happening, as people rushing ahead of things. They only got the money last summer. And I yeah, she said things, like we're not a charity, in response to people like Mike Brown Sr. and Tory Russell saying that they deserve some of that money. Apparently there was a sit down though with Mike Sr. And Patrice and some others, and some agreement of some sort was, I don't know, something. But she discussed, the grant making that they want to do, the organization building they want to do. But again, none of the criticism was dealt with from the people within the organization, from the Black people within the organization. So I thought that was it was just disingenuous. I thought, and uncritical. So when I brought that up to someone, a friend of mine on Instagram who defended the interview, their argument was, of course, which is always the first line, we'll interview her. And of course I said, I've reached out to her several times and invited her on, and she has not. And I can see why, because it obviously would have been a very different conversation. Or it could be dismissed as it would have been a very different conversation among a much smaller audience. I'm clear my audience is, or our audience isn't yet as what Marx is, or so anyway, but it would have been different. And but more than coming on with me, my point was they ignored all of the criticism of all those other chapters and all those other women and all those people doing that work. So it's not an issue so much of coming on here with me, although the invitation was made. It was more a question of, so I do want to come back and address that. I don't know if it's going to be here or with others, and I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think more needs to be said on that, and more time taken on that, not just because to pick on Patrice or Mark, but I think it says a lot about journalism, about media, about the framing of these discussions, about the relationship, the questions we've been trying to address here, the relationship of leaders to the community. I think there's a lot in there, and even the way they address the again, the trained Marxist line is referenced without reference to it occurring in our interview or in the context that interview arose. So I mean, it was just yeah. So the other thing I did mention, and in a few minutes we'll be joined by guests of again, I can't get this in my head straight, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, about this Black entrepreneurship's lethal pre-existing condition, the racial wealth divide during the COVID crisis, which I think we'll get into that. It says so much about, from my vantage point, the myths that we continue to see encouraged about Black business as a response to the current plight of Black America, or any group for that matter. But the other thing I did just want to bring up also is that I did also want to do something on this platform around the discussion that I had with Dr. Barbara Ransby on Mark Lamont Hill's platform about reparations. And I don't know if that's going to happen the way I was hoping she would come on live with me and we would watch the segment with you all and then discuss it. Points of agreement, disagreement, whatever. She hasn't said no to that, but she has, but she hasn't said yes yet either. So we have, and I don't know, and it looks like our planned meeting to talking about that isn't happening for about a month. So I don't know if I wanted to wait that long. I feel like, I don't know. So I don't know what I wanted to do about that, but I felt like it would be fun to do that. And the conversation, I thought was great and would be great to discuss in publicly in terms of where we disagree. And essentially all I was saying is the same thing I always say, that reparations is deserved, but it's ultimately a conservative claim that isn't big enough. And when what we're being encouraged to see as reparations, for instance, some payments to people in, for instance, Chicago or the Chicago area for housing or something along those lines shouldn't be considered reparative, since it's not, for a number of reasons. It's not national, it's not collective, and it's way too small. And doesn't even begin to address what Black people have suffered just in Illinois, never mind. But that we should, but that also limits us politically in terms of what I think ultimately should be our bigger goal, which is not only political power, but a redistribution of all the wealth, period. That's it. I mean, that's a summary of the disagreement, but that's really it. So it's not to say we shouldn't go for reparations. It's not to say I don't support reparations. It's just that I don't want that to be the ending point, and I don't want that to be the standard, and I don't want that to be what limits us from organizing for political power, not just reparations, and organizing to have that political power be fully redistributive. I need to get better at saying that. Still can't. Better at redistributing all the wealth so that nobody is suffering, period. And because, yeah, anyway, so that was it. That was it. Let me see. No, Craig, you're not late. Thanks for joining us. I just was starting. I was trying to get started Mondays at 12 o'clock as a routine. But I was just sort of setting the stage a little bit for, well, I don't want to try to make her argument for her. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted her to be here and why I wanted us to play the segment, because the segment got edited so you don't see the full thing. It's only like, I think 12 and a half minutes. And then even the whole thing doesn't, I think, fully lay out. But essentially she supports reparations and thinks that we should have them. And that's it. I mean, so if I'm not mistaken, I mean, that's essentially it. It wasn't, so we never even got to questions of what form reparations would take or how exactly we would get them. I was simply just saying, but at one point she raised the example of, and I keep forgetting the details, but it was I think $20,000 payments to Black residents in Chicago, something like that. And I was just simply saying that's great. But I don't want to call that reparations. I mean, it could be called, I think I was trying to say something like it could be called, I don't know, some sort of compensation for, but first of all, like, so that was, so we didn't get into this, but that was part of what I wanted to talk about, which we have talked about elsewhere on this, elsewhere here, at least, that, like, go back to our conversation with Norman Finkelstein. Again, the comparison to Jews needs to be understood. Jews didn't get anything, certainly not relative to what they suffered, and most Jews got nothing. And the Japanese got one-time payouts of $18,000 to $20,000 for the billions of dollars of wealth they lost just in the California lands and property and businesses that were taken from them when they were put in internment camps. So I'm not saying Dr. Ransby is arguing that I'm not saying, I don't know exactly but what I was just trying to say is I don't want to get into, we're already in this long protracted argument over reparations for enslavement. We can't even get a bill passed for a study. We can't even get, there are variations of approaches to what it should look like and who should qualify. I think it's largely a distraction. And I think that's one reason why the establishment enjoys having the discussion to the extent that they're willing, and why even establishment politicians were willing to engage it during their campaigns to a certain extent, because it's not threatening. It's not something they expect would work, could happen, is realistic. And it's not something ultimately that, even if it did, would happen in a way that they would feel threatened in their positions of power. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm not really sure. Anyway, I'm not really sure what issue that would, so that's why I'm hoping we can work this out, anyway, I'm hoping we can figure that out. I'm waiting for a few more of our guests to show up. In the meanwhile, please do get the likes up, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the join button. And what else? Yeah, Nas, the ear doctor did his thing Saturday for sure, Sunday night for sure. Sundays, 8 p.m. Eastern. Good morning to you as well. Good afternoon, really. If this is morning for you, especially if you're on the East Coast, congratulations. Congratulations for that being your life. That 12:30 p.m. could be morning. Anyway, listen, let's do this, everybody. I'm going to step out. Let's take a quick break. We have a couple of our guests showing up. We have at least one more we're expecting to talk with us about the latest, or one of the latest, I shouldn't say the latest, they do a lot, from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and the paper that we put together called Black Entrepreneurship's Lethal Pre-Existing Condition, the Racial Wealth Divide During the COVID Crisis. We're going to take a quick, as they say, bio break and come right back and get into this with those guests. So don't go anywhere. Please stick around right here again at I Mix What I Like Live at Black Power Media. And yeah, we'll be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back to I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Thanks for sticking around with us this afternoon. I want to quickly just bring up what is that? I don't know what that is. First of all, I just want to welcome Jamie, Dedrick, and Joshua, all here from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Dedrick is the chief of the Race Wealth the Race and Wealth Community, I believe it's called. And forgive me, Joshua and Jamie, I do not have your exact titles in front of me. Jamie, I will just call the from my point of view, the leading superstar, brilliant researcher who dragged me. Joshua, ooh, what is that sound though? What is that sound, Jamie? Is that? I think, unfortunately, Jamie, that's I think on your end somewhere. So I'm just going to mute you temporarily. Joshua didn't have as much chance to interact with you directly. Came on from my, I came on with you late on. You, I'm forgetting your exact title, but please tell me what that is. And forgive me, just not having that in front of me.
So I just joined the team as the Director of Racial Economic Equity. Okay,
thank you very much. And of course, for anyone who knows of me and my work, Dedrick and I go way back many years. And he's been a guest on many of, whatever platform I've had over the years, over those years, including most recently in an episode of Academics and Cars, where we got to ride in his car as he gave me a ride to pick up my car from the shop. So it was a perfect way to talk about the racial wealth divide, going to pick up my broken down vehicle. Anyway, the initial reason why I'm happy to have you all here is because of the recently published work, which of course is on a different tab, but can be found here at the website for the National Coalition, for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. I keep not getting that right.
It doesn't flow very easy, so I understand.
Well, it's just, it's, some of us just struggle more than others on certain things, but somewhere down here we go. On the reports, huh?
Yeah,
here we go.
There you go.
This report here, the Black Entrepreneurship's Lethal Pre-Existing Condition, the Racial Wealth Divide during the COVID crisis. So, Dedrick, let me at least start with you and just ask you to tell us a little bit. First of all, tell us a little bit about NCRC and your work within it. And then how does this report fit within that work? And then we'll get into some of the details of that.
Great. So NCRC, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, started off in the late 90s as an organization designed to bring together advocates around CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act in particular. CRA comes out of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was part of the 1968 Civil Rights Bill, which is an interesting thing to look at. I'm forgetting all the components, but the Fair Housing Act was one. There was some increased rights for Native Americans as another component. There was the kind of beginning of hate laws, of creating stronger civil rights violations for states or those that impeded particularly African Americans who were trying to vote or transportation or what have you. And then a very interesting, this is all a side piece, but I still find it interesting. There was also an anti-riot component of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which is interesting and helped me understand how they got it passed. Is that we'll do some positive things here, but we're going to punish, because we have to remember in 1968, after Martin Luther King was killed, there were hundreds of cities on fire in rebellions toward the killing of Dr. King. And so they did a kind of, we'll do some things positive on civil rights, and we're going to promise to lock up all of those rioters that protesters were dismissed at in 68. But anyway, all of that, the Community Reinvestment Act came out of that. And this was an idea to hold financial institutions more accountable for investment into historically marginalized, predominantly Black communities. And in the 1990s, NCRC was created to bring together advocates to try to strengthen CRA. And at the time, there was concern about weakening CRA, as so much of civil rights legislation was weakened during the 80s. And then I came on board a couple of years ago and created the Race, Wealth, and Community Division, which is different departments, and trying to bring a stronger racial wealth divide focus. And I think probably the best thing I've done thus far is created the Racial Economic Equity Department, which Joshua and Jamie are the leaders of.
Right on. And I did look it up here. I had the Jamie is the Racial Economic Equality Coordinator, and again, Joshua is the Director of Racial Wealth Equity. But Dedrick, real quick before we go any further, particularly for the audience that I and we end up engaging often, and certainly is in the audience here. Before we get into the details of this report, what do you say to revolutionaries about your work and the conclusions that are reached in your work? I keep presenting this as a great resource and a great non-revolutionary resource that so we're not advocating. I don't want revolutionaries watching this channel to think that we are this is the manifesto that we are advocating for them. This is just some
yeah.
But what do you say? What do you say when folks
I mean, I guess to me, I see it as I think revolutionaries recognize that there's also a need for people to exist as we're organizing for the revolution, right? I think only your most simplistic revolutionary will think that the revolution is around the corner, and so all we should be doing is raising consciousness or creating the armed militia that will overthrow the government, right? Like anything from, even like the Black Panther Party, what have you, they have a breakfast program, right? It doesn't mean that giving free meals to kids will bring forth the revolution, but it can be an important component to support your people, be an opportunity to educate your people as you're feeding your people. I look at most of the work around racial wealth divide as something trying to be similar, trying to have more investments into whether it's Black workers, Black businesses, creating different, bridging different aspects of racial economic inequality, not to confuse that itself is the revolution, though I do think if we really did bridge the racial wealth divide, it would require a revolution because it is so broad and systematic. So I do think that, but I think, things that are looking at specific pieces around Black entrepreneurship. And I guess to me, I think it is important. One of the important things we do is we help deconstruct some of the myths that people have around entrepreneurship that, one of the basic myths was, well, Black people just don't engage in entrepreneurship enough. And if they, were more engaged, they would do better. But, we've done reports at NCRC and at previous places that highlight Blacks are more likely to get into entrepreneurship than others. So it's not a lack of motivation. And I think this report highlights a few very key components that even as African-American entrepreneurship has grown, it doesn't mean that Black revenue has grown. It doesn't mean that median income has grown. So that even though I am supportive of entrepreneurship, just being an entrepreneur doesn't mean you have more money, more wealth, more economic stability, or doing anything to bridge inequality. So I think if you look at it for that type of nuanced information, I'm hoping Black radicals, Black revolutionaries can see something important in reports like this that are fairly mainstream. Actually, fairly mainstream, but still different. Because the real mainstream reports just say, well, Blacks need to, work harder or, be an entrepreneur and then everything will be solved. And this report doesn't say that.
Right on. And again, just before we get to the details of that report, the last question, unless you wanted to add anything more about how this fits into the broader work of NCRC,
Well, so with that, I mean, a lot of people aren't familiar, and I think this is an interesting aspect of NCRC, aren't familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act, with the role that financial institutions play, not just as a bank is where you put your money or where you're withdrawing money or maybe you'll get a loan, but that banks actually have, because they are subsidized in so many different ways by the public, they have public duties that they must perform, that they're supposed to be held accountable for, and that banks aren't just private institutions. They're supposed to be investing in low to moderate income communities. We're trying to push more. They're trying to invest in outright historically disenfranchised racial and economic communities that have been disenfranchised. So I think an interesting thing about NCRC is it helps people understand that there's actually legal requirements for the public good in banks that they're not being held accountable to. And that is something we should be holding banks more accountable to.
Right on. The last, very quickly, the last question I have for you before we move on is why do you prefer use of the racial wealth divide as opposed to gap, which we often hear?
Yeah, and I've been using racial wealth divide as everyone else has been using racial wealth gap for almost 20 years, but it just when I first got into the field in 2003, gap to me just made it seem like it's incidental. Like, I mean, I was just like, oh, how did that happen? You know, it was just some little like hole in the road, right? While divide, I think, is more descriptive of the effects that racial economic inequality, racial wealth inequality has. It actually divides societies. It helps to maintain segregation. You know, and I oftentimes say when I do presentations, the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. And so I think divide is much more descriptive of what it was, how it was designed, and its implications.
Right on. All right, so Jamie, let me turn to you here, because for most of my involvement, at least with the project, you and I were paired to work together to pull out some of the research and try to organize some of the data. And I meant what I said at the beginning. I mean, you did a lot of the heavy lifting and dragged me across the finish line, and would often be the case. What I really liked about this project, which for me doesn't happen often enough, is the collaborative nature of the project, and the way, questions would be generated, and what would often happen, so for instance, Dedrick might raise a question for us to look into. Before I finished reading the email, you were already responding with facts and data you had found, so I was really, just really impressed by, your, but I just wanted to get any initial thoughts you had about being involved with this work, maybe how you came to this work. And then I definitely would like you to talk a little bit about some of the methods involved in the work. And then maybe we could start going through, I don't know if you all even have a preference for how you want to do this, but go through some of the, at least key, like the key takeaways from the book, the report, et cetera. But Jamie, anywhere in that you would want to start?
Yeah, I hope my sound is okay.
Perfect. Right on.
I came in specifically to NCRC while I was still in school studying sociology, and I'm really grateful that I was able to come into the orbit of people like Dedrick and yourself, who have a framing and an approach to this work that is typically not what is the framing. We were just talking in a previous meeting about sort of programmatic approaches that institutions usually have around racial representation. And I am really happy and grateful, like I said, to be working within this sort of framework, that investment needs to be holistic, and that although these certain things like addressing inequities in entrepreneurship are necessary, it is not addressing the whole ecosystem of inequities and the wealth divide that was intentional by certain institutions historically, and it wasn't just a coincidental thing. But in terms of the paper, it was really great collaborating with you. And as you said, the sort of working process was really interesting, especially since we started, I believe, maybe early October of 2020, when, I mean, obviously COVID is still developing situation, but especially at that time, everything was so in flux, and even regionally, state by state, things were so different. And also at the time, there was not as much data out there as we have now, especially broken down by race. So a lot of the process was really like iterative of, like you said, Dedrick posing a question, and even you and I hashing things out for a while in the morning, like sitting with the data that we had and trying to think of things, and obviously not trying to come to incredibly speculative conclusions that we had no evidence to back up. And then of course, over time, more data came out, more surveys that we were able to draw from. But yeah, I think even now, COVID is still speculative. Now we're sort of at a phase that feels a little bit more stable in terms of, vaccinations are coming out, and in terms of like public health closures that were really influencing the economy and the economic conditions for entrepreneurs, that is somewhat more stabilized. But I think that we're still going to see long-term effects for for the rest of 2021 and maybe even more in the future. So yeah, this is still a developing thing, and I'm excited to continue these conversations.
Right on. One of the things I thought was very interesting from the beginning was this doesn't become a focus of the paper, but just something that was noticed was that early on, some of the initial reporting about the damage COVID was going to do to Black business, from my point of view, seemed almost dangerously singularly sourced, if I'm getting that word out correct. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting about the process of helping to a certain extent with this paper is that just to see, because I've already seen questions about where some of the data is coming from, so we can get to that, but to see how you and then all of us were trying to find all that information. And to challenge the initial reporting and the singular sourcing, which journalistically just got regurgitated very, very quickly and almost too easily. But anyway, but before we go, just looking at some of these key takeaways, the first one I thought, and then Joshua, I want to ask you to chime in with maybe a little bit about your role in the paper and some of in interpreting some of the conclusions, but just starting with some of these key takeaways. It almost feels funny to feel like we had to state that Black America was in a crisis before COVID, but it seemed like it would be necessary to remind people that COVID wasn't the singular cause of this Black economic downfall. So on some levels, to read it now, it feels like it's like a duh, but at the same time, I still think it was important to have to say that. Yeah. Growth of Black entrepreneurship has not corresponded with economic growth, and to produce more personal and community wealth from Black entrepreneurship, public and private sector spending should be intentionally channeled to Black-owned businesses. Again, before we move on and get into some of the nuts and bolts, Joshua, I wanted to get your first round of thoughts and even maybe how not only your involvement, but how you think this paper can or is being used even in the furtherance of your own work.
Sure. So NCRC is very fortunate to have relationships with financial institutions, with policymakers, and even across community development corporations, CDFIs. I think we're at about 600 members at the moment. So part of the purpose of the report really is to allow the ecosystem of supporting businesses, particularly Black businesses, to respond and to respond more innovatively and differently than we had before. And you're right that it seems almost elementary to us to mention that Black Americans were in this crisis before COVID, but we started to see how even relief efforts post-COVID didn't address those precarious conditions. And it was really important, if we were going to move the system of partners in the right direction and make impact and do some meaningful change, we needed to call that out more specifically. So part of the report does, the report really centers around three really big takeaways. This idea that an increase in businesses doesn't necessarily correspond with an increase in revenue. We talk a lot about the geographic isolation of Black businesses, and then COVID's impact and how existing or precarious conditions or racial economic inequality kind of hindered Black businesses in their ability to find relief, to access relief. And that's been a historic precedent even before COVID. So it's our way to contribute to the conversation so that we can allow the system to respond a little bit differently than it has been.
Right.
And just to verbalize what you're showing, Jared, I mean, this was an important point that surprised me even a bit, that Black entrepreneurship greatly increased between 1992 to 2012 from 3.6% of firms to almost 10%, which is a substantial increase. And I didn't realize that much of an increase had happened with Black entrepreneurship, right? Black's only 13% of the population. So it's getting close to Blacks being, represented demographically, having their share of entrepreneurs. But then we see that follows, yet even Black entrepreneurship increasing almost threefold, the proportion of Black revenue, it that it decreased. I mean, that's the amazing thing. Like, it didn't even not.
That's what I mean.
Right. It didn't even just maintain it. It cut in half. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, and this is old data. Like, why wasn't this a big report in 2014 or 2016? Right. Like, this really, someone who's been in this space for years, how come I'm seeing this now in 2020, 2021 about we saw Black entrepreneurs lose half of revenue during the time of one of the greatest growth we've seen? Like, that should be a headline. It's not being discussed, still not being discussed. And I've only seen it really highlighted like this in our paper. And I think it's one important point to talk about as we talk.
Oh man, this one, first of all, I was selfishly so mad that I didn't know this before my book came out.
Yes.
Because I'm not like all these Gerald Horns and whoever's who produce these books. Who knows when I'm gonna write another one. So I'm I was just so mad because this to me, and then even initially, this final version is even an update on the numbers I was seeing at the point I was seeing the last draft of the paper. So when I went to Twitter, I was trying to give a preview, all excited, wait till this thing, because I had the wrong number, because I was saying it actually went up from, and I was making a joke that the revenue went up from 1 to 1.3% were the numbers that I had seen at the last point. And then the paper comes out and I was like, it's even worse.
I even, to talk about the data and also that things really haven't changed before this, I wanted to take a double look at updated numbers because, again, with lack of data, we wanted to be sensitive to the fact that most Black entrepreneurs are sole proprietors or non-employer firms. And the last data set that was able to capture non-employer firms was the 2012 survey of business owners. Since the release of this paper, or maybe during our final editing phases where we weren't able to get it in, the 2018 annual business survey by the census released estimates about non-employer firms. So I double checked and it's basically the same in 2017, which the data was comprised from. That it is still the fact that Black entrepreneurs or Black firm ownership, both non-employers and employers, is still about 9.9% of total firm representation, yet is still 0.5% of total revenue. So 5 years later, still the same, and that's even pre-COVID. So.
I mean, so again, just to reiterate and highlight, this is not an issue of Black people not starting businesses, not having that entrepreneurial spirit, as they say. So, by the way, what I thought we might do initially is go through the key findings, have you all comment on them, and then we'll skip to the conclusions, have you all comment on them, and then if we have time, go back through the comments and have you all take questions. I hope that makes sense, if that works. And then obviously, if anything that you all want to bring up that I'm not inviting you to, please make sure you just jump in and bring it up. But could someone who reads this say, well, this is because Black people just don't know how to run businesses, or they don't know how to pick the right businesses, or, there's something in their business acumen that is lacking? Because if another group of people started this many businesses, they would definitely be able to capture more of the national revenue. How do you think this paper or anything else in your work might address that kind of approach or question or critique?
And I think the sad part is that's the standard response. I mean, people will say it in a sophisticated way, right? People don't want to come out right and be like, well, Black people just don't know how to run businesses, but they'll try to say, oh, well, they need greater, financial training or mentorship, or, working closer with small business administrations, SBAs, these types of things, right? But it's a sophisticated way of saying, well, just Blacks don't know what they're doing. And that's why even when they increase their entrepreneurship numbers, they're making less revenue, But to me, again, this is to me why I center things around racial wealth divide. And, and your book, also does this similarly, that, you can't separate Black entrepreneurship from the Black community and from the racial wealth divide. So if you're creating Black businesses in a community that is in deep asset poverty, is much lower income, And most businesses are created to serve those people they know and people in their community. So you're creating a bit, and you're part of this community. So you usually have less wealth, less resources to invest, and then you're trying to push or sell your business to those who also have little bits of money. That's obviously going to create ongoing economic challenges. And that's the center of the problem of entrepreneurship is not lack of financial education or lack of drive, but it's the center of the socioeconomic problem of Black people and Native American people, and to an extent Latino people in the United States. It's racial wealth inequality, an economy that is deeply regressive and not designed to actually allow economic mobility for disenfranchised communities.
Mm-hmm.
I think, by the way, please go ahead. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
If I can add, business growth is also requires investment capital. And what we know about the history of this nation, that Black business owners are less likely to obtain loans, are more likely to be denied of those loans compared to their white counterparts, to pay higher interest rates compared to the white counterparts. So there's also a responsibility of the system of investors who hold capital to provide to these businesses, that we need to rethink how they're investing in Black businesses as well.
Yeah, right.
And I want to put out I think part of the reason to put this out during the COVID time is that during COVID, people were, ready to get past some of their initial prejudices or their initial stereotypes that, the American economy is great. America is great. If you're not doing well, it's your fault, right? People were willing during COVID to be like, well, things aren't great right now. People who have good businesses, people who are working hard might not be economically successful because of COVID. So it's time to, provide some support. So it's kind of, we were trying to strategically take that moment of when people are willing to recognize that the American economy doesn't just reward those who work hard, but actually there's larger problems that can cause economic challenges. And for most people's immediate mind was COVID, but I would put forth, racial economic inequality, the history of that, the marginalization of that are the root of things, and that it does require federal investment in order to get over these problems. And that's what, the title of this paper was trying to convey, that Black entrepreneurship's lethal pre-existing condition was the racial wealth divide during the COVID crisis. Just like African Americans weren't uniquely, had a uniquely contagious reaction to COVID, we were in bad health before COVID. And so then when a pandemic comes, we're going to have worse outcomes in that. So part of what needs to happen is we need to change our healthcare system so it actually takes care of all of American citizens, just like we need a entrepreneurship infrastructure that actually deals with low wealth communities. And just one final thing I'll put forward is, I think we could do a whole nother paper, because I do have questions. We haven't done enough analysis on this, but people still think of entrepreneurship, I think, like they did in the 50s and 60s, where everybody could just, you can open a mom and pop store and you have thriving small businesses, and maybe you could make a good living wage out of your small businesses. But I mean, we were already turning away from that in the 80s, or in the 90s in particular, with big stores like Amazon, Walmart, the idea of you competing against these multi-billion-dollar corporations. And now with things online, you're competing like Amazon. What does it even mean to start a small business, and what is really the opportunity of economic mobility for small businesses? I think there's even larger questions beyond the racial wealth divide. But what does entrepreneurship even mean in wealth development and economic mobility in 21st century America?
Wow. Yeah. First of all, to your point about Bezos, one of the things I was going to say just a minute ago is that one of the problems with how all of this is discussed is that when people try to blame Black people specifically for not doing well with business, it mythologizes how well white people are doing in this country, as if there's no class divide there. And this is, again, not to equate whatever, but it's just to say, look at these food lines that I see on the news, or look at some of these pockets of a lot of these pockets in white America, and Bezos being able to do what he was able to do does not mean even other white men can do what Bezos has done. So it's there are just so many layers of, and maybe we'll get to this, but one of the points that I thought was interesting in this paper, or in at least one of the points of research, was one, I don't think this part got to the final I don't remember honestly I don't think it got to the final version, but there was, to your point about the digital world, we were looking at one point into the prevalence of the sidepreneur phenomenon in Black America, where a lot of what is being described as entrepreneurialism are people on the side setting up some sort of, in many cases, online gig economy type of hustle. And that's just not, anyway, it doesn't seem sustainable in terms of, developing wealth for an entire community. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Well, Joshua, were you trying to jump in? No.
Sorry, did I miss you? Okay, yeah.
I think there is this definition too that we confuse about entrepreneurship, right? And again, like 80% of all businesses are sole proprietors, meaning there's no staff, there's one person, and that's their business, right? And now for
80% of Black businesses.
No, 80% of all.
Oh wow.
96% of Black businesses are sole proprietors, right? So I just want to highlight, it's not just that.
Well, I didn't even 80% of all businesses
are sole
across race. Wow.
Because again, and two, what's been even blowing my mind more so recently is how much we've been twisting the definition of entrepreneur. Like your Uber driver is an entrepreneur. I mean, okay. You know what I mean? Like, okay, like maybe, but like to equate that to someone starting a business and now having this life of economic mobility, it's like, people have 5 jobs, not because they're really driven just to make more money. It's because they have to, right? Like, you used to be able to have one full-time job with benefits to take care of your family, oftentimes one income for a household. Now we have 2 incomes for a household, if you're lucky enough to have, 2 adult figures in your household who might be having 2 or 3 jobs apiece, right? And so, but then this can get caught up in this, myth of, well, entrepreneurship is great and, more and more America are entrepreneurs. It's like, no, it's not great if you have to, in addition to your full-time job, now have to drive people around in your car in order to, maybe pay the rent in your place. So we have to really understand when people are talking about entrepreneurship, what we're really talking about. And we saw this in the COVID crisis, when the biggest initial highlighted thing for the COVID crisis was the PPP loans, right? This idea that we're going to give loans to businesses to help them going during this tough time. But this didn't take into account, the loans were to help make sure that businesses didn't lose employees. But if 80% of businesses don't have employees, that's not something that is really helping most businesses. And worse with the PPP loans is the banks were initially only giving it to businesses they have relationships with. So it's one thing for your business to have a couple employees, but it's another thing for you to have an ongoing regular relationship with the bank that you can regularly take loans out of. You can have, a lot of people have businesses with, it's a small amount, but with business, employees of 4 or 5 people, but it doesn't mean you're regularly getting loans from your bank. So the response was to help the most elite businesses get through the COVID crisis, when all the conversation was looking at the mom and pop store being shut down by COVID, right? So they give you one picture and they put a lot of money behind it, but they're leaving out, most of the others. There was one positive measure that was very helpful for small businesses that we can talk about, but it usually wasn't framed as an entrepreneurship measure.
Yeah, we should definitely. Anyway, this was another one of the key findings that you sort of have already been speaking to a little bit, that Black businesses are segregated by geography, industry, and asset poverty, similarly to the African American community as a whole. Jamie, I certainly found this part, to the extent that I was helping you on this, fascinating to see. Could you talk a little bit about, to answer one of the previous questions about, where some of the data coming from? You mentioned some of your method a minute ago, but could you talk a little bit about both these findings and how this data was mined or analyzed? That is, because I thought it was, again, fascinating to just see the numbers of where Black people are physically, and that also being isolated in terms of the sectors of the economy that the businesses could be in.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, a lot of the data is that we drew from at the time. As I said, we wanted to capture the non-employer firms. So we drew a lot from the survey of business owners, which, as I mentioned, has now been replaced by the census with the annual business survey. And we also drew from other reports, which I'll mention in case anyone I see in the chat wants some sources. I'm sure we can provide emails at the end. I can send some materials, but
and some of it is cited in the paper, just so
yeah.
people know. I mean, there are, it's not, there are sources there so people can, but anyway, sorry.
Yeah, but there's all that survey information is broken down geographically and also by industry. Obviously, sort of business concentration is going to be where there's population concentration. So there is more Black firm ownership where there's larger Black populations, such as in the South. So, and also I think a really interesting point is the industry concentration. And to your point, Jared, earlier about people's common conceptions of Black entrepreneurs are entering into certain industries. Why don't they just go into something more lucrative? I think one of the findings about this was that they are entering into these industries because, as Joshua mentioned, there's a large amount of startup capital needed for certain more lucrative industries. You need degrees and certifications for other industries like real estate or business management, those sorts of things that are really costly. And if you are unable to get something such as a loan, it would have to come out of pocket, which is a heavy investment. So it limits the amount of industries which a person can enter into. And not to say that these are not industries worth entering into, it's just that the ability to enter into some of those higher paying industries is not an equal opportunity. And I think that really speaks to the pre-existing condition factor of this, that these are the industries that are not only worse off during COVID, but were also industries that certain populations maybe were limited to access to. So,
and it's also a consolidated arena that people are being asked to enter. It's not, that these major sectors of the economy and manufacturing and whatever, high tech or whatever, there's not, I mean, there's like a handful of big operators that clearly dominate. So it's not like there's all this open room in the business world for anyway, so you can't just say, well, Black people why don't you just start manufacturing cars then?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
a little more complicated than that. Yeah. Okay. Good.
I think Joshua had a lot. He did a lot of analysis around the geography and stuff. And so
yeah. Please.
There. And I got totally lost. I didn't even see the comments until Jamie said it, and I started looking. I was like, oh wow. Okay,
yeah, sometimes, honestly, to be honest, I sometimes block it on my screen because it can become very entertaining and distracting. So I try to come back. I'm going to try to come back to some of it when we get through a little bit, but because I'm sure there are going to be some good questions and comments. But Joshua, did you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore that this point that you're showing really shows two things. It shows, one, that that Black businesses many Black businesses are reliant upon their local clientele or customer base, which is often low wealth Americans. So that is part of the revenue discrepancy that we are seeing that we need to address in resources and other things. But it also underscores that even when there is a significant presence of Black-owned businesses, there's still a divide in terms of median income in those particular communities compared to White counterparts. And I think all of it really underscores the fact that if we want to use entrepreneurship as an avenue for bridging the racial wealth divide, we've got to take a considerable look at Black wealth, generally speaking. And the need to think about how the wealth of Black businesses and their customer base can either grow or hinder that revenue growth that we're seeing.
And actually, I'll pull out of this. And again, we're in the report, and we pull out bigger than the report because a lot of the issues are bigger than what is in the report. But was talking with Jamie and Joshua previously about people estimate that entrepreneurship's the third, biggest component of Americans' wealth. But the data sets I'm looking at where they have wealth, it's actually a category of wealth and like secondary property or like non-primary residence. And so it's not even clear to me, like what proportion of wealth entrepreneurship is for most Americans as a whole. I mean, when you combine it with like secondary housing or something like that, it was something like 15% or something like that of wealth makeup. But when a little bit of looking, I could find the majority of that is secondary property, owning a vacation home, owning a secondary home. And so I do think we overhype as a whole the effects that entrepreneurship has on average people's wealth. And I think that is a way of kind of pushing people away from looking at how the economy is structured, what type of investment should be happening in people, and instead just pushing people into, well, just become an entrepreneur and you can have wealth. And I think we're seeing that is, it's a very small amount of wealth for most Americans. Most Americans get their wealth from home ownership, some type of retirement account they put in. And that's why wealth is pretty limited for most Americans and extremely limited for Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans.
I also like, for me at least, I also like this section because in addition to what I think you all have already said, this also challenges the prevailing mythology still persistent all over the place about the circulating dollar within the Black community. That, the unsourced claim that keeps coming up that, about how often the dollar circulates in other communities versus the Black community loses sight of the fact that if you circulate a low level amount of dollars within a low wealth producing sector of the economy, business wise, within poor community, it just becomes that's not, you can't create wealth that way.
And we did that during outright segregation because we had to, right? When you couldn't shop at a white store, then we had, and some people, as you go back, the economy was better for Black people in the 1940s. I haven't seen data that shows that. You know what I mean? I really haven't seen data that shows that. And so again, it goes back to your original point. If it's a few, you can have $5 go around your community all day. It's still only $5, right? It's only going to generate that type of benefit.
And it's not going into something that can flip it into something else. And in other words, it doesn't become the investment that you needed to become it does. Because $5 never becomes a multi-billion-dollar investment, right? Like it requires millions to get to billions, right? Like it takes tens of millions, right? And so you have to have a good amount of money. You were quickly saying, Black people starting a car company. We've seen that one of the first people to really start an American car company a long time was Elon Musk, right? He was a multi-millionaire who had friends with other multi-millionaires and still barely managed to do it, but did it. And I would say million, I'm undercounting as a millionaire. It's not like he had 5 million, right? He had tens of millions, getting close to 100 millions, and then was connected to billionaires. And he was able to barely start a car company, right? A car company, right? That's right. Yeah. And by the way, even within white populations, this has not changed the overall condition of people within that community. So if you were rich and white before Elon Musk created his car company, you're likely exactly where you were before, and if you were poor and white and before he started the company, you're just as poor and just as white as you are now. So this idea again that it automatically works to the collective also is something that I think.
Well, and that's an interesting point too about when white Americans became majority middle class, right, in the 40s and 50s, right? It wasn't really through massive entrepreneurship, right? I mean, I think that's also something to think about. Like it was through being able to get jobs that had benefits. Right, and government created a lot of jobs, and the United States was at the top of the world economy because the rest of the white powers were still licking their wounds from World War II and were greatly hurt. So we had the economy in the world plus massive investments into the white American, what would become middle class, and that created but it wasn't that all of a sudden whites just decided to open up mom and pop stores and then we created American middle class. It was massive government investment. And that's what we're going to need if we're going to, this report again is focused on entrepreneurship. If we want to strengthen Black entrepreneurship, we're going to need massive government investment in Black entrepreneurship. But if we want to also strengthen Black people as a whole, we have to invest in Black people, as a whole, not just into mom and pop shops or side entrepreneurs or what have you.
So the last two key findings are here from the report, that Black businesses are hobbled by racial economic inequality and a lack of investment, and that pre-existing conditions limited Black businesses' ability to receive COVID-19 relief and hinder a quick recovery. I'm to all three of you, I don't want to just keep going through the same order, but I'm tempted to just ask you again, Jamie, to start. But anybody can jump in. How did we arrive at these conclusions, and what more could be said about these conclusions that have been reached here? Either of these two.
Well, I think that, as we've just been saying, that as this key finding says, the low revenue generation, the low rates of pay, the lack of capital infusion directly led to the disproportionate impact of COVID. I think that the next finding is and that section of the paper is when we go more into like the PPP disparities, and back to not only the banking relationships, the lack of banking relationships among Black entrepreneurs and Black populations in general, derived from a lot of distrust, valid distrust, and other issues in terms of financial institutions, but also, again, to the just the infrastructure of Black-owned businesses. Not only are they more often solo entrepreneurs or non-employer firms, but they're also just generally smaller firms. So they don't have an accounting division or a in-house accountant or a assistant or someone who can help them facilitate the PPP loan process, application, things like that. They don't have, if it's a solo entrepreneur, they're not only shouldering the business, the administrative stuff, but also the actual processes. If it's outward facing, if they are a barber or a insert here, whatever was the dominant industries, if they're the only one, they're not only providing the services, but also dealing with the business administrative stuff. So they have very low capacity, understandably, to do this whole loan process on their own, which is pretty confusing. So that, I think, was a really interesting and important finding for myself, to realize that lack of infrastructure, just by nature of its of these firms' disinvestment or lack of capital.
Right on. Anybody else on any comments on those before? Otherwise, we can talk a little bit about the key solutions, and then I can look for some questions in the comments in the chats, or comments and questions in the chat.
I'll put forward that just one look in the comments. Bosco777, or however you say his name, he is right. He's right that Elon Musk did not start Tesla. We were more talking about first car company. You're right. He got it from somebody else. He's been the face of it. Yeah, Musk has never started anything else. I mean, well, with government money, and there was a decent amount of private capital that was also involved in getting it going. But that is correct. And then someone had put in something about, is this an indictment against capitalism? And what I'll put forward is, I think it is clearly, as we're getting to the solutions, an indictment on this idea that some just magical free market will create wealth through entrepreneurship, right? And I think if you look at the solutions, we don't just point to, okay, well, people just learn how the free market works and then, reap your rewards. We understand that, what creates wealth is capital, investment capital, and that actually government investment in people, in police force, and whatever it's investing in is what allows things to grow and be substantial. And I think you'll see a lot of that in our solutions if we want to get into that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, one of those solutions is to focus direct stimulus payments in areas where Black business and Black revenue is concentrated. Black consumers, typically the primary customers of Black businesses, are particularly lacking supplemental funds in this time due to business closures, consequential job loss, and decimated incomes. Providing supplemental stimulus money to predominantly Black communities and their Black businesses could spur more economic activity.
And that's just a sophisticated nonprofit way of saying that we can't solve the racial wealth divide unless you invest in Black people, right? Like you can't solve the problems of Black entrepreneurship if Black people are left in poverty. Let me ask you, Jordan, quick. Have you talked about? I haven't seen the last few of your shows much about Charles Blow's what's the book called? The Devil You Know, or something like that?
No, I have not. I didn't even know honestly, after Charles Blow, what was it? Was it last year or 2 years? When he said something on Twitter. Oh man, it was something akin. I'm not getting it right, but it was something akin to something that was blasphemous. Is like, like Nat Turner, something crazy. Like if Nat Turner was alive today, he would have started a Black-owned business. Something as crazy as that. It wasn't quite that insane, but it was on that level of. It irritated me at that level that I haven't been paying him attention for so long. So I honestly don't know what the.
Well, according to this report, he wouldn't have done very well, Nat Turner, in his
right.
But the reason I bring it up is it does relate to this idea of Black communities, Black geography. I think it's interesting that this guy, who was kind of the Black voice of the New York Times for years, is now pointing to this idea that Black people need to move to pretty much the historically, whether it was RAM or whether it's the Nation of Islam or what have you, but create a Black America, right? Pretty much from the mid-Atlantic states down to Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. And it's crazy.
Are you serious?
This is his book. This is his newest book, For the Devil You Know, is like he's saying Black America needs to move in. We need to invest in this because Black people will only be free if we actually have power over states. And the way the country system is working is you can't have freedom at the federal level. You have to control the state. And so it's very interesting. Even the title, The Devil You Know, makes me think he's really kind of taking some Elijah Muhammad program and then kind of New York Timesing it. But anyway, I do think it's some interesting pieces to that, in that, again, we can't really solve Black businesses unless we're really focusing in on Black communities. And a lot of the places where, Black businesses are most prevalent and where Black communities are the places with the weakest financial infrastructure, the weakest amount of, or the least amount of national banks. Like in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, New Orleans, like, you barely find JP Morgan Chase banks or what have you. So I do think, this understanding of, if we're ever serious, and as Biden administration, others are talking racial equity all the time, well, are there investments going into these spaces where these communities are? Are they going disproportionately? Because that's the only way we're really going to see kind of improvements in these communities if we target where these communities live.
But that's it. That was it. No, Randall. I'm sorry. Randall got it right. That was the quote. Thank you. That Nat Turner was a serial murderer who was revered. That's what he said. He called him a serial murderer. And that was, thank you, Randall. Cause I was like, how dare you? But I don't want to, yeah, but that's a very.
So
anyway,
John Brown too, right? And there's a lot. I mean, and so was George Washington, and so was like most presidents killed a lot of people. But
first of all, we already know. Like, look, because I think I said all this on Twitter at the time. But first of all, Nat Turner only killed one person by his own hand, so you can't even if you want to call it murder. And not justifiable, whatever. It was just one. I don't think that qualifies as serial. But anyway, but whatever. The point is, I couldn't believe he said that. But so anyway, he seems to have taken a very interesting turn.
Yeah.
Maybe he, I don't know. I guess he doesn't have that New York Times check. I don't know. Maybe once you move, he can. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. That's interesting. I will look at that.
And actually, someone's hiding. The Devil You Know, a Black Power manifesto. You see, Jared, you got to check this out. And have a whole conversation on it. I know you all would love this.
That is fascinating. Okay. I'm more interested in the character who wrote it, admittedly, at this point, than the actual argument. So that's I have to admit that right now. I haven't gotten over that level of shock yet. So but yeah, I'll definitely look into it and get into it. Before I move on, Jamie and Joshua, was there anything you wanted to jump in and say? I feel like I've lost track of that whole. I lost track of where I was. But anybody want to? Okay, all right, okay. The other solutions. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, the federal procurement programs need to be more targeted, more strongly implemented toward Black businesses. And again, that's a kind of sophisticated, I don't know how sophisticated it is, but a nonprofit way of saying that, we need federal money going directly into Black entrepreneurship if we're going to strengthen Black entrepreneurship. It's not going to happen through some broad program that people will act like it's helping small business, like the PPP. And I'm not against the PPP. I'm just against what people were acting like the PPP was going to do. And it was never designed to actually deal with and actually that's a big challenge I have. Oftentimes, even people trying to do work with Black businesses, they're only aimed at the top 4%. They're only aimed at the businesses that actually have employees. And I'm not even 100% against that, but just be clear, be clear what you're doing. Like, okay, I'm not focusing on strengthening most Black businesses. I'm just focusing on the 4% that have employees, and this is what we're going to do to make them better. But when you say we're helping Black businesses, but you're only helping 4% of Black businesses at best, you're misleading people. So let's be really clear what we're talking about when we're talking about strengthening Black entrepreneurship.
That's a really important point. In fact, can you restate at least some of that? Because I think that's a really important point that gets lost in a lot of the conversations around the efficacy of Black businesses to helping the Black community.
Yeah.
The 4% dividing line is, again, the dividing line. What is being divided, the 4% here?
4% is 4% of Black businesses have employees, right?
Right.
And so a lot of the work that's out there, like particularly too, when we talk about Black entrepreneurship, I mean, not just Black entrepreneurship, we're talking about entrepreneurship, they want to talk about lending and how we need to provide more capital. But honestly, that's not the primary issue for most side entrepreneurs or people with no staff. Like, you don't need usually a bigger loan in order to strengthen your business. You might need a grant to help you, bring in a part-time worker, and so you can move things forward. But actually, lending doesn't become something that people deal with until they have employees. And even usually it's beyond having 1 or 2 employees. You usually need to have 5, 10. That's where you start getting into the area where, okay, well, maybe I could use, a loan to help me, move things forward. But actually, generally, more than a loan, you need a procurement contract. You need a contract. And that's something I've been talking to Joshua and Jamie about. It's usually a mix of things. Like, all right, maybe you need a loan to help you buy more things, but you also need a government contract or a contracts period that then says, all right, I'm bringing a loan to hire some more people, and now we can produce more things, and now have a contract right here to help, to pay for this.
That says we're going to buy X amount of what you're producing, like, in advance, right? That you're going to.
It's just like job training programs. Like, you don't need a job training program unless there's a job placement program at the end, right? People don't need just to be trained; they need to be placed, right? And just like I think with entrepreneurship, they don't just need training in entrepreneurship or even loans; they need contracts so they have somewhere to go with this new opportunity. That would be a serious focus on entrepreneurship, on Black entrepreneurship in general. Is that type of specifics, and we very rarely do that. We just kind of maybe talk about loans, maybe talk about training, these types of things.
And to Dedrick's earlier point about the system of partners focusing only on like the top tier Black businesses, there's a lot of questions in the chat around, why we recommend investing in regional banks into Black banks, which is the thoughts above where you're showing the screen now. And I think it's simply because, we understand that, businesses who need capital the most don't have relationships to these traditional bankers and traditional institutions. And there's a lot of survey data out there that shows that regional banks and community banks like credit unions or community development financial institutions are closely related to these communities where they can build those relationships. And there's even data out there that says much of the COVID relief funds have come from institutions that are smaller in asset size versus larger in asset size. So there's a unique need to invest in the infrastructure and in the system of institutions being Black-led institutions, so that access to capital is a lot strengthened, and the understanding of the needs of those businesses are further amplified as we move along.
Is this, Joshua, is this sort of the question you're talking about here? Or is one of the how do community development banks work with Black businesses? Have they provided much help with loans? Or is this addressed in your answer, or is this question answered in the last response you just gave, or does this paper deal with this specific question, or do you have a particular response to this question?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the access to banking and access to capital within the report. And part of our recommendations is yes, we need to invest in more community-based banks. I think, they've been more responsive, I believe, to businesses, particularly Black businesses in need, because of their proximity to communities of color and Black businesses of color and compared to other more traditional businesses. And I think you're finding, and Dedrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but even in the market, I think larger institutions are finding value in putting all of their capital and all of their investments in support of racial equity into banks such as CDFI, so they can, uniquely address the needs of Black businesses on the local grassroots level.
And I think what you're getting at, Joshua, and at what's his name? El Sendero was getting at. You also said the report says that Black banks and FI, I'm assuming he means financial institutions, to be more targeted Black entrepreneurship, but why would a Black bank assess risk any differently than any other bank? It is true, Black banks are small. Small banks do oftentimes will get to know their clients more and provide more leeway in their lending. The secret is big banks, they don't really care about these small loans, right? Like, they don't even care about small mortgages. Like, they're trying to make a certain amount of money. If the loan isn't over a few $100,000 or more, they're not interested. The big bank's not trying to do a $50,000 loan, a $20,000 loan. You kind of have to go to a community development financial institution, a small local bank. And the way banks have been consolidating so much, there's less and less of the small banks that get to know the local communities. And so when you're talking about Black banks, you are inherently talking about small banks. And so they do a better job of doing that type of lending. But it's also true, Black banks don't have that much to lend and also have very narrow margins that they're dealing with. So they can't do a lot of loans that they can't guarantee get some payment with, right? So that's why, again, you need government, you need philanthropic efforts, because it's not just lending. You just need direct investment. But it is true, smaller banks usually do better for smaller lending.
Just quickly, before I go to any other questions, I know we're sort of headed towards the end here for our conversation. I want to make sure for any of the three of you that is there anything from this report or tangential to this paper that I haven't invited you to bring up that you would like to bring up before we wrap up? I just want to, if you don't even have anything immediately, just think about that for a second. I want to make sure that, nobody leaves thinking, damn, I wish I had said that. But one question that I see here, and I'm not sure we're all in agreement with what is happening here, but if entrepreneurship does not develop wealth as a whole for marginalized peoples, what is at the base for pushing this messaging? What is its purpose and function? What is it doing?
Sure. Yeah. So what I would say is, its purpose and function. And I think, this is true in, like, if I write a report on A, it doesn't mean A is the end all and be all of everything. It means I'm writing on this particular thing, right? And there's a lot of conversation around entrepreneurship during the COVID crisis, a lot of goodwill to helping small businesses. So I was trying to take advantage of that opportunity to highlight the ongoing problems of Black entrepreneurship pre-COVID for the last 50, 60 years, and what I assume is going to be post-COVID. Because I know what happens is, it's like, yay, COVID is over, and now we can forget all these things, and trying to highlight, well, Black entrepreneurship was weak beforehand, Black entrepreneurship, was weakened during, and Black entrepreneurship is going, probably be weakened in the future, unless we're going to, as Biden say, build back better. If we're serious about that, let's build back better entrepreneurship. For as limited as it is, it's still like, I'll still be happy if those 4% of Black businesses are in a better situation. I won't be appeased, but I still think that'd be a positive step forward if we can strengthen Black entrepreneurship as we're spending trillions of dollars. Like, what do we like, 10, 11 trillion dollars? Can we just get some to help some small aspect of Black racial economic inequality before? Because I know that the tide's going to turn, and in 6 months it'll be like, well, we spent 10, 15 trillion dollars giving the economy a going. Now we have to worry about deficits. Now we don't have any money, and we never got anything, right? One thing we did get, which I hope we maintain, I think was the most beneficial things for Black entrepreneurship, was when they allowed unemployment benefits to go to people who are entrepreneurs, right? Who don't have a, quote, regular 9-to-5 job. And I think that's one of the best things that could be maintained to help strengthen Black entrepreneurship. You shouldn't punish people that because they try to go in business for themselves, if it doesn't work out, they can't get unemployment. If you really want to create an entrepreneurial safety net, allow people who are in business for themselves to get unemployment benefits. That was one of the most beneficial things that happened during the COVID crisis. And I think it gets a small, minor reform, but important, I think, nonetheless. We should keep that. And, and so it will allow people to, go in and, start their own little business. And if it doesn't work out, get unemployment. And I think that just be helpful for Black economic finances in general. And I think it shows a relationship that is not much difference between a Black worker and a Black entrepreneur. Like, we're kind of all, I saw someone in there say, I was an entrepreneur for 15 years. I was never more subservient to the white supremacist system than when I was an entrepreneur. There's a lot of myths out there that if you're an entrepreneur, you're completely independent. That's not true, right? You're kind of a servant to the business. So it just, I think helping us understand how workers and entrepreneurs are really in the same situation unless you're at a very elite level.
And I don't think we're arguing that entrepreneurship is not necessarily a wealth generator. I think we're arguing that it's not generating wealth at the levels equal to white counterparts. And I think our purpose here is to address the racial wealth divide. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And we have to start thinking about how we're investing in entrepreneurship a little bit differently. Let's not just create new businesses. Let's figure out how do we scale existing ones. Let's not just create, loan and credit products. How do we create the products that mitigate the burden of Black entrepreneurs so that they can grow, and they can create their jobs as their businesses continues to grow? I think we just need to think about the system a little bit differently to generate the level of wealth that businesses among other racial groups are achieving that Black Americans aren't.
And I was also, I think Joshua was hitting an important point. What do we mean by wealth, right? Like, we don't define entrepreneurship. We don't define by wealth, right? Like, again, median white wealth is 180,000, right? That's not, a lot of people talk about wealth. They're thinking they're like big money, right? Median Black wealth, not including depreciating assets. Well, it will include depreciating assets. It's like 24,000, right? So that's not much. That's not, it's much less than 180,000. So, Black entrepreneurship can create some wealth, but I think some people think of wealth, they think of $1 million or that you're completely economic secure. You don't have to work anymore. Like, wealth are just assets that help you get through. And it's one of the most important things. Sorry, go ahead, Jared.
I want you to say what the number is when you don't factor in depreciating assets for Black wealth. Cause I think that's a big,
that's right.
For me, it was a big issue.
Yeah. So not including depreciating assets, median wealth for whites, I think is 150, 160,000. For Blacks, it is now around, I think it's just 3,600, 4,000. No, actually, no, it went up. Sorry, to about $7,000. To about $7,000. So it's not that much money, and that's why, again, if you lose your job for a couple months, and that's all you had, and that's median. That's not the poorest. That's median. Right. It's a deep financial crisis. Within 2 weeks, within a month, or if you have to get a new car all of a sudden. It shows the ongoing economic insecurity. And I think this also gets to, a foundation of wealth is government service. I think we've seen this a little bit in COVID. Like, if you can't get healthcare, if you can't get unemployment benefits during hard times, wealth provides stability. You need that type of government support. And that is, the reality of Black people. We're in such deep economic insecurity. We need that, government support in order to provide some stability so you can have growth and you can have private assets. We don't talk enough in a racial wealth divide field that wealth isn't just your private assets. It's also public assets. And if you have health insurance, if you have these things, that doesn't come on your private ledger, but it's a very important asset. It's a very important part of wealth. And that's a much larger conversation that's not discussed enough in the racial wealth divide or racial wealth gap conversations.
I just pulled this up just very quickly to because this is actually one of my favorite suggestions in the paper, because to me it's a very good way to practically deal with some of the more business-minded folks in the community when it comes to talking about practical solutions or platforms to develop for voting or whatever, to say, listen, advocate for universal health care because it's going to help Black businesses.
That's right. That's right. If you're talking to capitalists, right? If you're talking to capitalists, give unemployment benefits so people can be businesses. I don't care what your rationale is. I'll throw at you what I need to, right? So if supporting entrepreneurship is the way you can get universal health care, let's get it, you know?
Let's get it. Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, obviously the details of that argument are in the paper. We encourage people to see it, and the link will be put in the description to this video when it goes up. But Jamie, Joshua, Dedrick, let me invite any closing thoughts, comments, and I really appreciate not only the chance to work with you all on this, but that you all would come through and talk about it. I think it and a lot of the work that you all do is very important in helping us, better understand what the hell is going on out here.
Yeah. So Dedrick always checks me on my optimism, but I do think that there is a Biden administration. With the Biden administration, there's an opportunity for us to really rethink this work and how it's important to racial equity. More specifically, there's a lot of money being thrown out in response to the American Rescue Plan to continue to not only support businesses in COVID, but to set a pathway for growth moving forward. And I think, any persons listening who are in this particular space or are advocating for this space, there's an opportunity to use this money for good and to use it to generate better impact than we've seen in the numbers we've talked about earlier today. So I'm hopeful that we can begin to see a change in the trajectory of our businesses if we can continue to use the money that's being allotted more strategically and wisely.
Hey, well, I suppose somebody's got to be optimistic in that way. That's right. So more power to you, Joshua, because
Jamie, do you have anything to add in?
Yeah, I'll just note that the topics covered in our paper is definitely not the end all be all. Like we were saying, we're definitely not saying that entrepreneurship is not a wealth builder and it should be the main wealth builder, or that entrepreneurship is a surefire way to economic security. And we're also not saying that these solutions are the only solutions. I saw some people mention cooperative economics, and I think that's a very valid approach and definitely is worth talking about, but unfortunately it was not talked about in this paper or was in this scope. So I just want to note that there's definitely a lot of avenues out there. This is just like we were saying, just that acknowledging the disparities that were pre-existing, the disparities that were present during COVID, and with those in mind, what can we do in the future? But definitely not the end of the conversation.
Right on. Thank you.
And I'll try to be as optimistic as I can be. I'll try to put on my Joshua. I mean, the optimistic thing is that the country has all of a sudden been willing to spend trillions of dollars, right, to invest in the economy, period, right? So there's plenty of money out there. Now, what I'm not as optimistic about is not clear at all to me that we're on any type of path of actually bridging racial wealth divide with these investments. But I do think what's important is just, can we really seriously, if we're saying, here's a positive thing, we're talking about racial equity all the time. So can we get some real analysis now and some real numbers about how these things are going to actually benefit people? I think if we had that, we actually could make some important progress. My concern is that people think you can just say, it's like racial equity is abracadabra. You just say it, and by saying it, it creates racial equity. No, it doesn't by saying it. It's by actually putting money where it needs to go. What problem are you really trying to address? Are you really trying to address the 96% of Black businesses that have no employees? Are you trying to address the Black communities are in asset poverty, so they actually have money to spend and could sustain a business. So I think that's the thing, and that's what these papers are. It's really trying to highlight more clearly what are the metrics that we should be looking at. What is the reality behind Black entrepreneurship? And if you're serious, even at a local level on addressing these issues, maybe you can use some of this analysis to do something positive in your community and have a better understanding of what Black business really looks like.
Look, I really appreciate it. I mean, it's great information. People with their own ideologies and politics can make work of it as they will. Anyway, if there's any optimism for me in being involved in this project, is that at least this is a good reminder that not everybody out here is as dumb and trifling as those in power. So I greatly speaking of powers opposite.
No, she likes to dive into all my Zoom calls.
No, so hey, more power to you. Mine run away from mine now, so they're too old and cool now. They're all in their fresh in their teenagery. They too cool for my live stream. So congratulations, she looks adorable. Anyway, Jamie, Joshua, Dedrick, again, thanks for letting me be a part of this project. Thanks for the good work. I appreciate it. And I look forward to talking with all of you some more as we, cover more NCRC reports. I really appreciate it.
Great working with you, Jared.
No, thank you for having us.
Right on. Thank you. Anytime. Take good care, good people. Appreciate you.
Bye. Thanks.
All right, good people. So don't go anywhere, because in a few minutes, Kamau Franklin is going to join us to talk from a different perspective about how to address all of these issues. From me, I would say it's the discussion we just had was informative, for information purposes only, as they say. The discussion we're going to have with Kamau is maybe more akin to, for me at least, what folks need to be doing and working on to address those concerns. So, and again, I just say, I said while she was here, big, again, shout out to Jamie. She is really sharp and did a lot of that, a lot of the heavy lifting on the research. And it was great to see all that happen. And participate in it. To me, again, the paper is very revealing, and it is a great, again, non-revolutionary response to those who make the equally non-revolutionary or more non-revolutionary argument that Black business and entrepreneurialism can, in and of itself, be used to change material conditions for Black people. And the paper is a great source for those looking to be critical of Black capitalism, of the Black business argument, and for those who may, depending on circles you move in or who you're trying to talk to, if you're not trying to talk, if you're tactically, sometimes I've found that if you're trying to convince someone, it's good to have just solid research that's not connected necessarily to a radical ideological perspective in its overtness. To get the message across. So that's what I think the paper is good for doing. Was entrepreneurship discussed as creating jobs void of fair wages? I don't think specifically, other than to say, now I can't remember what was said versus what's in the paper. But I don't think specifically. One thing that the paper I know addresses is the fact that most Black-owned businesses that have employees pay those employees at, significantly, I don't have it in front of me, but significantly less than the minimum wage or the average salary or the median salary paid to working people generally. But again, only 4% of those businesses have employees. So in terms of Black entrepreneurialism, if I'm understanding the question, Ricky, you can't, the paper does show how the creating of jobs does not create improvement in wages. And in fact, Black people have captured less overall with the businesses of the national revenue than after creating 2 million businesses since 1996 that existed before those 2 million jobs. So in other words, creating more Black-owned businesses does not help either with wages or an overall capture of the national revenue spent on business, on commerce. So, you know, it's just another I think a series of research or data that you know. Anyway, so listen, let's take another quick break, please. If you can, please stick around just a few more minutes. Kamau Franklin is going to join us for another discussion of his work and community movement builders, and an update on the Fridge Lady. There's an important update on the Fridge Lady. So stick around. We'll be back in just a minute right here at I Mix What I Like live on Black Power Media. Don't go anywhere. As they used to say, don't touch that dial when they used to have dials and all that. Remember dials? Anybody have dials? Or who remembers the dials that you had to turn because the knob broke off with pliers to get one of 3, maybe 4 black and white channels? Anyway, back in just a second. Peace, everybody. All right, good people. I appreciate you, so many of you sticking around. Please continue to invite your friends, colleagues, comrades, and please continue to, as we want to invite you to, click join to become a member of BPM. If that isn't something you find perfectly suitable to you, please click like, share, subscribe, and all of that. Because all of that helps us and do more of what we're doing, which includes starting tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Eastern, Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, starting April 20th, 4/20 at 8 a.m. We have the Remix Morning Show. We have new shows coming on board. We have so much happening. And in fact, I mentioned it earlier, check it out. And just before we get to Kamau, so I mentioned that the authors of Generation Mixed Goes to School are coming on Friday. And I mentioned how we might disagree. And I mentioned how I emailed them and said, do we disagree? And I sent them the interview that I did with Brother Netfa about my unscientific thoughts about the prevalence of mixed race presentation in pop culture. Well, I got a response. I don't think from Dr. Joseph, I don't think this betrays anything, because she says excitedly, keep reading. Because remember I said I hadn't read. I've only read a little bit. She says, we say that the primetime featuring of Mixtish, the show, is revolutionary, particularly for us Gen Xers, thinking about what kids today are able to view versus what we were in terms of representation. But we come down pretty hard on the actual representation as being mired in a very unhelpful, binaristic, and tragic view of race and a mixed race, and is quite frankly very different from what our kid participants described. So wow, end quote, wow. Shout out to Dr. Joseph. She'll be here on Friday, as will her co-author and comrade, colleague, Dr. Allison Briscoe Smith. So don't miss that one. That's Friday right here at I Mix What I Like Live. Let me go ahead and bring up my next guest. Obviously, he's no stranger to this show, to this platform. He's a co-founder, co-owner of the platform, co-host of Renegade Culture, and a member of Community Movement Builders, movement attorney, author, all those good things. Kamau Franklin, what's up, my man? Good to see you. Thanks for joining us and joining me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes, well, you made the joke actually that I hadn't invited you on and CBS had and all of that, but it's a good, it made a lot of sense, because not only because, obviously there's much more to say than one interview, even with the great Dr. CBS. But there's an update that I'm very anxious for you to share, because when I heard, and I want to get to a whole bunch of other stuff, but when I heard your discussion of your work with Community Movement Builders, which I do want us to come back to, and you told the story of the fridge lady, I thought it was a story. It was so funny on so many different levels, because it talks about, not only the story itself is kind of funny, but it says so much about what it means to be an activist, what struggle brings, the contradictions, the conflicts, this one. And then since your appearance on The Last Dope Intellectual, there's been some updates. Yeah. So I did want to invite, a quick maybe summary of CMB, how the fridge lady story fits in, and then get to the update. And then we'll get back to some other, other aspects of your work. But anyway. Cool. We start there, yeah.
Well, yeah. So quick, Community Movement Builders is a grassroots organization created now about 4 or 5 years ago. We have chapters in several different cities, and the organizing work we do is around gentrification and police brutality, particularly here in Atlanta chapter. Then we also do what we call sustainable development work. So that's developing cooperatives. Folks know I've talked about it several times. We got a CMOS cooperative, a food cooperative, an aquaponics cooperative, a security cooperative that does a cop watch. and safety patrol. And then we also do mutual aid, the folks in the Southwest Atlanta community that we work in. And then we also have a community stabilization fund that we help support folks with their utilities, their rent, their mortgage, that kind of thing. And, you know, I would say at this stage, almost a third of our membership actually comes from that particular community that we started working in. But obviously, a lot of folks who've joined us are folks who have sort of organizing and activist backgrounds, people who want to sort of find their place in terms of getting down and supporting their folks. We consider ourselves a mass-based organization. And so to skip to the fridge story, which is one of those things is like, you know, I tell folks, of all the things I've ever done to sort of piss people off as an organizer, as an activist, to be radical, this was like the least idea thinking that this would be something that became controversial for this neighborhood. So basically there's a organization called Free Fridge, and they asked us through a contact if we could host a refrigerator in a community garden that we are the caretakers of, that's right next door to our house. And we have been the caretakers of this park for 6 years. This is a city park. And when we became the caretakers, the park was in disarray, right? It was weeds were 6-7 feet high. Nothing was growing. Nobody was bothering with it. We put our own resources in it to clean it up. And so we've been doing that for like the last 4 or 5 years again. And so we said, yeah, let's put this fridge in here. This fridge was meant for folks in the neighborhood to come take food out, to, you know, go cook it at their home. It's food like, you know, finding your refrigerator at home. There's a pantry right next to it. There's a volunteer system, folks who stock it, so forth and so on. And one particular person who had moved in about 2 years ago, who actually used the refrigerator, then became somehow a critic of the refrigerator because he started saying that it would impact her property value. And this is a Black woman, a woman who, again, lived in the neighborhood for about 2 years. And she actually, to her credit, organized with the new white neighbors who also started to complain about the refrigerator because they started saying it brought in an element, a criminal element to the community. And that's a quote. And so they did a petition drive. They brought in the Parks Department. They brought in the neighborhood association, the city council person, to try to force us to remove the refrigerator. We battled back and forth. In fact, it was the first time that the Parks Department had been in the park for 6 years. And they came to the park trying to tell us the rules and regulations, although they hadn't been there for 6 years. The person who headed the neighborhood association, again, for the first time in 6 years, at least since we've been there, asked the cop to come facilitate help in case something happened at a meeting that we were facilitating with the neighbors. White cop who was wearing a Blue Lives Matter mask.
Oh man!
So it's like and this guy used to be on our neighborhood, on our board as an organization, as a neighborhood person. So, you know, the dynamics of sort of Black middle classism, the white gentrifiers, the Black gentrifiers, started to play out. And the woman who had the fridge, she decided whose fridge it was, their organization. She didn't want to have that battle. So she decided to remove it. We sort of went back and forth. We were like, oh, okay, it's not the hill we're going to die on. We'll try to do some other things to sort of resuscitate some of the some of the relationships with some of the neighbors, that kind of thing. But then there's one particular woman who's a gentrifier, who's a self-described gentrifier. She then called the police on us in terms of our activities in the park twice. And she called code enforcement on us to give us a code violation. And then she contacted the local NPR affiliate in Georgia, GPBA, Georgia Public Broadcasting. And they did a story from her side in which she sort of gave this false equivalency argument of how are we going to try to chase white people out of a neighborhood? This is the same thing as when white folks chase Black folks out of a neighborhood. And then they printed it without telling us, or they ran a story without telling us they were running a story, and did a pre-interview with me, but never told me that this was going to be an interview that was going to be used for the story. Never gave me a chance to combat let's say, her false charges against us, including she called me the owner of the property. And you know, I want to be clear, unlike some other folks, I don't own multiple properties for myself to go live in. That property is owned by the community. It's owned by the organization. We also own a lot across the street that we're trying to build a second house, community house on. And then, after all of that, I decided, what the hell, if you want to fight, let's just fight. So now we're going to put a free fridge back, and we're going to put it, instead of the park, we're just going to put it on our property and just have that fight, let them call code enforcement, and just have that struggle, because the fridge provided a service for folks during COVID. And in this poor working class Black community, one of the last in Atlanta, for folks to have access to free food, healthy food, things they could take home and cook. And this is a place where people would walk over and take food out with their kids and go. Some people would drive up, almost like they were shopping, take a bag, load up on some food, get back in their car and go about their way. No quote unquote crimes have taken place, even though they tried to suggest such. But, so all of that to say is, we just figured, you know what, if y'all want to fight, we can fight. Because when someone calls the cops on an organization like ours, obviously there's historical precedent for what can happen when an organization that flies a red, black, and green flag, that has a mural that says protect the Black community, that stands strong on radical politics. These are entryways for the police, the city government, and other folks to try to do damage to our organization. And it's not something that we can just let stand. So that's the short update.
So I want to make sure everybody knows that they can go to communitymovementbuilders.org for more information, to support, because that last part of your response really appeals to me personally. That whole thing of, once somebody says, "Oh, you want to fight," then that's it. Then let's get it. Yeah, I love it. So my first thought is, so I got a number of, my first thought, well, actually, let me skip past the first few thoughts. One of the thoughts that I have is, I would like to help you all get the biggest, most garish, overdoing it refrigerator. How do we get the biggest some industrial freezer?
Well, we already got it. We got the refrigerator. In fact, this weekend we started taking measurements for where exactly the refrigerator would go. So we were probably less than 2 weeks from loading up and being like, let's just, let's hunt for bear. Let's just put this up and see what happens. And then the other quick amusing part of the story is, I'm not sure if this brother, I doubt if he cares if it's public, but I get a text from Professor Griff, obviously a Public Enemy fame, out the blue. And I don't know the brother, we just been on the show together. He's a Kalonji's contact. And then he gives me a call. I want to chat it up. And he asked me about what's the situation in the community about the fridge. I heard y'all had a fridge in the middle of the street and all that kind of stuff. I was like, what? It's like, what are you talking about? So, I break down the story. He tells me as a friend, he tells me her name. I don't recognize the name. But I go through the whole story of, what I just did. And I'm like, but I don't recognize the name of that person you're talking about. The person I know, who is the big gentrifier, is this Black woman named Nicole. He's like, no, that's her. He's like, her name is Nicole. I've known her for 12, 15 years. In fact, he says he met her at Farrakhan's house, her and her boyfriend. I was like, what? And this woman has actually called our members, as we've walked down the street doing canvassing, a black devils for the work that we do in the neighborhood. So I was like, I guess I can see the wealth building thing in terms of their particular politics. I was like, so she knows you for 10 years. And, you said they do gun training, whatever. And she's been to Farrakhan's house. And this is her position on a community doing organizing work to keep the Black community intact. So so we got our fridge ready. We just building out our encasement. We ready to roll. We figure we're going to have to fight with the city, Parks Department, and everybody else. So let's just make it happen.
All right. Well, everybody go to communitymovementbuilders.org and donate whatever you can, or buy some CMOS, which I did too. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say quickly, if they want to support something that's really on the horizon, it's another big project for us. It's actually not that that's going to happen in this short time period, but it's the building of the second community house. So we have that. We're going to do a GoFundMe campaign later on, but whatever anybody wants to give and support, we're going to build a second community house because we want to establish more organizers and activists in that neighborhood. So we see it as sort of workforce housing for organizers. In exchange for cheap rent, you live in a neighborhood and you do organizing in that community. So not only do we work to help politicize with folks in the neighborhood, right? But we also bring people in the neighborhood who are working class organizers who can also help facilitate the organization itself and the organizing itself. So we see that as something major. We own the land plot outright. And so basically we are going through now, getting our survey done and looking. My wife on the side is passing me a note, again, we all know.
B said, "Get what's up, Ed? Get."
Again, yeah, there you go. Yeah, she said, if you're going to tell all the story about the Nicole Farrakhan, talk about the limits of black bootstrap capitalism.
Oh,
so just want to make sure we talk about that too. And she's right.
Happily.
Like, folks, and most of these folks too, they get in here and they think even when they sell those homes that they're going to be able to stay in Atlanta, but they don't understand that they're at the outer edge of the core of gentrification. So even if you sell your home for $280,000 and you paid $150,000 for it, that's a good bag. That's not going to keep you in Atlanta because all the other core areas have already been gentrified. You're going to be pushed further outside of Atlanta, further outside your job space, further outside any sort of social services and community space that you've had prior to that. And so these folks are setting up something for a minimal payoff, right? Particularly in a neighborhood that's mostly renters. Right, the black folks in there are mostly renters, and they're the ones who are going to suffer too as the rents go up and as folks push to redo their homes so that they can sell them now for higher prices. So all of this means that the working class and poor black community in Atlanta, as it has been for the last 15 and 20 years, is going to continually get pushed out to a point where Atlanta would no longer be quote unquote recognizable as a so-called black Mecca, if it ever was one, of course, but as a so-called black Mecca for black folks to come settle and do things in.
So is this the politics of the fridge lady that it's black bourgeoisie ownership not wanting a community to prevent gentrification because it would prevent the rise of their proproperty value?
That's exactly her position. That's her position. She's of the thinking that this is all, as I think she told a reporter. It's like, she's trying to create black generational wealth. I know you can go hard on that. So that's why I like people pause.
I mean, I was going to say she's going to walk away with $300,000-$400,000. That's it. And then she would still have to go buy another home. So that's generational wealth. You're not having created wealth for yourself, much less a generation. I mean, and then again, if the issue, which is often attached to these arguments about black home ownership or black capitalism, is that it's going to be good for the community. This is clearly not a community focused argument. This is, I want my bag. and you with your community stuff are messing up my bag. So I'm going to call the white cops and the white NPR. I mean, that's just, my God.
Yeah.
But the reason why, when I first heard you tell the first part of this with CBS, honestly, that was my first reaction was honestly, to be perfectly honest with everybody, it was an old, what I consider my old man reaction, because I was saying, see, this is what young folks who haven't really been in organizing spaces have to still learn. Like, this shit is complicated. There's so many nuance levels and so many, it just gets really messy and complicated. And then sometimes it's hard not only to identify a clear politic, but to practice it, or to have it be seen as being the practice of clear politics because of all these kinds of things. So anyway, I that's not a particular question, but I did.
No, for me, I mean, it's all about how deeply you dig into community, right? And this is the tough parts of it. When we talk about community organizing or doing radical organizing, it's not like everybody on the ground has the same politics, whatever those politics are that they express and or don't express, right? A lot of folks are looking to get out the hood, and that's what they think the politics are. Folks are looking just to survive. They're looking just to sort of get over, right? So you got the sort of the lump-in proletariat folks that you got to deal with. So when you commit yourself to really digging into a community and doing that work, it's not some romanticized vision of like you're just going to walk in, you're going to radicalize everybody overnight, and they're just going to follow your path forward. Because whatever we think and whatever folks already do know about how the system operates, from their point of view, it's about survival at that moment, right? Not everybody, but a good portion of folks is about survival at that moment. And so they're thinking about, are you gonna mess up their hustle? Or what's the game that they can run on you? Or what's your game that you're trying to run on them, right? Or who are you now? You're like the 15th organization to come up in here in the last 4 years, offering something, saying something, and then 6 months later, you guys are out of here doing something else, right? So all of these things are things that you got to contemplate, think about, and do when you commit yourself really to doing grassroots organizing and saying you want to organize people on the ground, right? You're not just trying to do policy work. I'm not trying to purposely shit on anybody, but you're not trying to do policy work or just get people out to the polls, but you're actually trying to do something that's politically a political education campaign, along with organizing and programs that's around how do these folks become the base of support for any change that happens in that community.
It's also very different than teaching in a classroom, no matter how radical we think we are with that, or radically broadcasting or doing journalism or media work, which is often, a lot easier. People have said, since we started doing these live streams, people have said, Jared, you do so many live streams, it's put in a lot of hard work. I'm like, it's not hard work. This is fun. I have a lot of fun, and I think I could do better in, levels of preparation at times and stuff like that, and put in some more work there. But even that's not hard work. I don't think that is hard work. This is, that's the work that I've engaged in, admittedly the least, and found the hardest. I mean, it is,
it's always sort of moved me. I remember I like when I saw some of those old civil rights clips, and one guy mentioned that there's a big difference between teaching Marxism in a university and teaching it at a freedom school, right? Or teaching some version thereof of like practicing a certain sense of socialist politics, right? So, but it's always been, I think I've always been a little shy, even though I do a lot of it now, these podcast things around doing media work. But obviously, if you can't reach people on a broad scale, then, you got to figure out ways to pull in your organizers, your activists, people people see these programs, and sometimes it's the first, second, or third step for them in terms of getting politicized. So these programs do a lot because the same way I got politicized, we've talked about this off here too, hearing some of my mom's stories and watching old civil rights stuff of like folks marching and demonstrating and all that kind of stuff. That was the stuff that sort of galvanized me to be like, oh, I want to be active. Is there a movement now? I think I was so crazy at one point. I actually looked in the phone book for the Organization for Afro-American Unity. This is like trying to see if it still existed. Because I'm like, how do I get involved? Where's this at in the phone book? You know what I mean? Malcolm's organization, is that still around? So, these platforms, they do create the sort of energy and the synergy sometimes when you're at that place in your life to take those steps to say, like, I want to get more deeply involved in my community.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned. It's funny you even hear you say phone book. Because when I left, I remember leaving the military, and I remember literally the first drive home from Norfolk, and I just had this vague notion, like I'm about to get it, like I'm about to get in this struggle, but I had no idea with who or where. I didn't know what. I was like, it's like I'm just whenever I get home, I'm gonna find these motherfuckers and get in.
My first organization ever. And at the time, I was already an atheist. Before I was really politicized, I already was like, this guy thing don't work for me. I'm not quite sure. I was a kid, I was like 17, 18, 19. I would take a Bible in front of my mom's and be like, it's a book. And I drop it on the floor for effect. That kind of thing. It was like,
wow, you were hard. That was, you were
it was like the angst of a kid. You're like how shocking can I be to you, So, but when I was in college and I reading Malcolm and starting reading about sort of the history of the Black Power movement, I remember I went to my Black Studies department, and the head of the Black Studies department, his name is going to escape me. This is at Baruch College in Manhattan, part of CUNY. He gave me the number to an organization that was a political organization, but it was also a Christian organization. And it met at Reverend Daughtry's church, who was a famous organizer and pastor in New York days. And that was my first organization. I went there for weeks, like sitting down and chopping it up. And they would talk really political stuff around internationalism and so forth. And I left it when at one point, it was around Halloween. There was an organization of the African Organization of the People's Organization of Christians, something like that. But at Halloween, they started talking about how it was a devil's holiday. And that was just like,
wow.
like, wait a minute, we just talked imperialist politics 5 seconds ago. And now we're on to the devil. I was like, let me see what else I can find out there. And actually, December 12th movement, another organization at that time period, was actually meeting in the church too. This church was on Atlantic Avenue. And so I sort of slowly but surely sort of inched my way over there before I found that organization. And actually several others before I found sort of a home base that I stayed with for a while.
Right on, right on. I was going to say, James. Yeah, I see you, James Thompson, moving these pallets every day, and I guess that's why you always got your bare chest out to show the muscles you got from moving all those. Is that the point? Is that what we're doing here? I see you out there. He's like, you gonna see my muscles from moving these pallets.
Doing that work,
real work.
Do that work. You gotta do that work.
And I love when I meet people like that. You give them a handshake, and they're like, they feel the softness in my hands. They're like, you haven't worked a day in your life, and I'm like, I've been trying not to. I'm proud of that. I've been avoiding it as much as possible. You damn right. I keep my hands as soft, and this is possible. Anyway,
I'm gonna have to use
but
that.
Real quick,
people say the same thing to me.
I'm like, I'm proud of it. I don't want to do that hard work. Every time I did hard work, it sucked. I was terrible. And I never believed the mythology about, you the working man making the world move. Nah. I need something much easier than this. But before we go anywhere else, I did want to, the point you raised about what CMD does with property is, I think, an important distinction. I know you made a joke about, the Patrice Cullors thing and all of that, but what is CMB doing? What is the sort of the philosophy of property within CMB?
I think for us, it's one of those things where we can be esoteric if we want to about the importance of land and property, or we can try to sort of dig deep, even with a small resource organization like ourselves, and try to figure out what is it that we can control, what is it we can have ownership over. And so when we got the opportunity to have the community house several years ago, we had a funder, a trust fund, dude who purchased a house for $60,000. That was a win, because I remembered when I was a 20-something-year-old organizer, activist, we had a community house to work out of. It was like, it would be on, right? Some space that you can call your own. Nobody else could kick you out at night. It's where you can do all your work from. It could be a headquarters. So that was something that just was like that's important. And I actually think, when we talk about organizing in the Black community, we are sort of a show me people, right? And when you look at some of the organizations that are some of the biggest organizations that ever existed in terms of radical organizing, or even sort of towards the sort of Black nationalist bend, it's the organizations that can show the Nation, the UNIA, even the Panthers to an extent, that can show that they have control over something, right? And it's not just something, again, it's not just strictly policy, and then the policy gets won, and then you don't necessarily feel any sort of life force changing, or you don't see how that impacts your community. So for us, as much as we can, it's very important for us as a community to control where we live. And part of that is controlling the physical property, right? So again, we're not some well-financed organization, but we've been able to sort of do these 2 properties that we have. Eventually, if we're able to buy a 3rd and a 4th, we're going to create land trusts. We're also doing something similar with our Detroit chapter, who also has a community house. We're right now in the process of purchasing a 2nd and maybe a 3rd, because Detroit's prices are so low that we got to create these models. For me, we got to create these models of resistance. And some of that is show us what you can do for the community, and then with the community, so that folks feel like, 1, there's that presence, 2, there's that building, 3, they can see sort of some change that they can participate in, as opposed to sort of strictly being asked to lobby, or even sometimes just to tell their stories of what poverty has done to them. No, how do we work our way towards building some institutions and organizations that we control? And we know these are models, but again, these help politicize people. They help bring people into the fold and join organizations, and believe that, through our efforts and our challenging of the state apparatus, that sort of dual power aspect of challenging the state apparatus, but at the same time creating organizational apparatuses that we ourselves control, I think is what helps to make people stay with you sort of longevity wise, help you build sort of the alternative models that you think are necessary to destroy capitalism, again, as you challenge the state apparatus. So I think those things work in tandem. So for us, it's extremely important to think about how land is used in our community. Again, not just on the policy level, but how we physically start to have some control over property resources, commercial spaces, and so forth, so we can begin building that future that we want to see for our people in our community.
And and people, bigging you up in the comments for the wise words and whatnot. I don't know if I've heard you talk too much about this publicly, and I don't mean to put your business out there, but it's beyond for Kamau just wise words. I mean, you literally moved south at one point. You literally said that, I'm going to put my whole, not just, I guess money where my mouth, whatever the phrase is, you put your whole family's bodies where your politics are. There's a better phrase in there somewhere, but you did that. And I think it's commendable. I mean, having a family myself, even if I had wanted to do that, I wouldn't have gotten the permission. So I know the internal struggle that had to happen in the family. I get all of that to make that happen. So big ups to the family for doing all of that. That's not just an individual choice. But so anyway, I just wanted to shout you out for that, because I think that's one of the more impressive things that I've seen, from people that I know doing activist work. I mean, you got up and said we need to be in the South doing stuff with people, with our community, literally on the land. Initially to Jackson, if I'm not mistaken, and now in Atlanta. Could you say a word or two about that? Just what all that meant, what was like?
I think for me, it's when I was convinced that the formula for liberation was around organizing for our people, right? That's what we got to do. It's not that we got to. We can't get away with half measures, right? So if you're going to commit yourself to it, and as a young organizer, I was a little bit of a zealot. Like I was that dude. I had buttons on the backpack, every organization you can name, the political prisoners. I had literature in my bag. I even went to law school. I had the political T-shirt on, same thing with the backpack and the buttons. Just look at me like, what you got to say? Who's got the comment? What I got to say? What you got? What you know about, right? So that that's been part of what I believed in, and I believe that those around me also believed in that, right? So I wouldn't have put my sort of body and thinking process and ideas, and I stepped away from what I thought was like sort of a careerism. I went to law school. And I'm not saying this for big ups purpose, but I went to law school for to be a lawyer, because that was what sort of like at that stage it felt like I could contribute to the movement in terms of some practical skill. So that kind of stuff was always, once I became politicized, it was more about how could you do it as opposed to if you could do it, or why you should not do it, right? I don't believe in some of these hyper liberal phrases that we kick around today around like, if you don't come from a particular community, you can't organize in it. It's like the Black condition for me is very similar all around the country. Obviously, there's some nuances, there's some things that you have to learn about sort of the locality, but to somehow suggest that our liberation is based on what we do in a local area as opposed to not only what we do there locally, but what we do in other places locally, and how those things add up to a national movement and an international movement and Pan-Africanism. For me, and internationalism and that sense of solidarity, to me, we make the same mistakes as either folks have made in the past, or we really don't have the trust in our ideology for us to succeed. So I say to that stuff, it's for me, part and parcel of being politicized is what is it that you do to make those politics happen. When I see, those of us who create organizations. And I was just thinking about this earlier. We create organizations of 5 people, 10 people, 15 people. But when you talk to folks, they're like, you know what? We have enough in common that we should be linking up and doing this work together. And, let's just have one name and just do that. You get the hemming and the hawing, because people are much more happier being in their small little world where they are the leader of 5 people than whether or not they be the co-leader of 15 people or 20 people or working together in some bigger way. So for me, it's like, how do we build movement, right? How do we build organizational apparatuses that are going to fight for our folks and our liberation? And that stuff has always meant sort of a lot in terms of at least how my reading and interpreting of sort of liberation politics, not only in America, but around the world. So, we read about how folks leave one region and go to another because that was asked of them from the movement or from their liberation struggle. And I think that's, again, part of when I got politicized, is what I started, it's what I believed. And so I think if we are serious about liberation politics, then as much as possible, we have to do what we can to not only be where we need to be, but create what we need to create, do it with others, figure out our mistakes, come back and try again, because it's like, it's cliche, but when no one's going to save us but us, and so we don't continue to figure it out around what's the organizational apparatuses that we need as a people, then we're always going to be prey to sort of not only to the big machine and block of like capitalism and white supremacy, but the parts of it that pick off aspects of our movement, the liberalization of what organizing looks like, the sort of non-profitization what organizing looks like, the sort of consulting gigs that everybody strives to get, and these like lobbying and just policy gigs that really drive us back into sort of the liberal stronghold in the Democratic Party, right? So I think if we're really radicals and we're really revolutionary, really talking about abolition, then we have to break away from that stuff and really sit down and figure out how do we work together to build radical revolutionary organizational apparatuses.
So Craig is asking, going back to the specifics, I think about CMB, but how do you manage varied interests of those who show up to your organization? And I was even thinking of those who might even show up to take on the cheaper rents for activism in the community to live in those houses in the community homes, but. It's also linked. I also put it in the, connected to what I wanted to ask you about anyway, about mass-based organizations. Community Movement Builders is a mass-based organization. So similar to what Craig is asking about, how do you manage the varied interests? What does it mean to be a mass-based organization and working with the various politics or groups or ideas of people that show up in that formation?
I mean, mass-based organization basically is folks have some similar politics or some points of unity or some things that they can agree upon, but they're not sort of a clear ideological position on everything, right? And so, again, it allows for an array of folks to come in, everybody who considers themselves to be communist, socialist, Marxist, even anarchists, to people who are like, I just want to help the Black community, right? So you have to deal with that array of politics, and this is why, again, I think sometimes, leadership and how we think of what we're building becomes important, because we have to make space for those who want to come in, who are at a certain level, and then, provide and teach and work with those ideas towards building a similar political apparatus and political ideology, but one is not necessarily as exacting. And so, even though we are a mass base, I would say the tendencies of most of us, particularly myself, who started the organization, would be centered around sort of a revolutionary nationalism politic, right? So we're anti-capitalist, we believe in socialism, and we believe that we as a people have to create self-sustaining, self-determining organizational structures that we run and we control, right? Those are some of the basic premises of the organization, but you don't have to be sort of steep into it. You just gotta, in general, want to work with Black folks and understand that we work with everybody. We have affiliate organizations that support our work. Again, we support in solidarity other causes that we think are similar to ours or that stand on against anti-imperialist politics. But in our core, we're about organizing Black folks on the ground. And so there's got to be an understanding that people are, and particularly these days, right? Because I think it was even easier when I was a young organizer because the scope of politics was not as wide as it is today. I think we have a wider scope. I think some of that is great. I think some of that can be overwhelming. I think young people, I know I was probably a handful in my 20s. I know young folks in their 20s or 30s can be very, very persistent about their politics and very sort of like, I'm right and you're wrong. And if you don't get with it, you don't get with what I'm telling you, I'm out. And I was like, ain't you been organizing for 3 weeks? What isn't this the first organization you ever joined? And now you're going to be all, very unyielding in your politics, and you're so self-assured at 25 that you feel like you're just going to dictate what takes place. And I think so there has to be this level of trying at least to work with folks and do that. But I also think there's this idea of like not being overly liberal, right? So to brother's question, the person's question, you can't just come in and say you're going to do anything that you want to do. We have committees, we have areas of work. If someone comes up with a good idea and others are for it, then we figure out ways to expand on it. If the time is there, if the energy is there, if we have the resources. But for the most part, we don't believe in single issue organizing. Our community is got so many different things that we want to do that we think there's like 5 or 6 things with our level of support and membership that we can handle at one point. And so we try to integrate those things into each other, but try to do the things that we think are important. And that, for us, it's again, on the ground organizing, sustainability, developing alternative economic cooperatives, organizing with people on the ground in the organization, creating ways to keep people in that neighborhood through stability funding and through mutual aid. Those are the things that we can currently handle on the ground. So those are the things that we emphasize and that we try to do, and we ask folks to get down with it.
So real quick, somebody else asked about this, but the same thing. Why somebody I think asked, what does CMOS do? But I was more curious, like why is CMB selling CMOS? How did you get into that? And I just got the gel, but honestly, I haven't figured out, and my daughters haven't moved fast enough on this either, how to use it and what like how to cook with it yet or anything. But how did that develop? The CMOS
well, that
product?
developed, we were developing several cooperatives at the same time. And the one that I was most keen on at the time was this kale chip cooperative, which still we didn't get off the ground. But that's the one I've been pushing. That one seems like we can grow kale in a community garden. We have this, I forgot what it's called. It's not a dehumidifier. It's, it takes the water out and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So we got that, almost an industrial size one. So we were trying to work on that. And then somebody who joined the organization, this brother who actually, brother and his wife, and they actually started Dangerous Negro several years ago, and it's still up and running. They do like apparel, T-shirts, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so they were working already on their own CMOS brand. And so we were chopping it up around sort of our connections with stores and other places, and how that might be something that, because of the work it takes, that we could actually get to a point of needing to hire worker owners fairly quickly, since they've already started it. And so we combine forces to create a cooperative, right? And it's community CMOS. We make it out of like, their house. It's getting to a point where I think, they have a new addition to their family. So it's getting to a point where, we have to think about how do we move from this mom and pop level to getting commercial space, to hiring. This year, we think we will probably hire our first worker, who later in the year will become our first worker owner. When we started the CMOS, I too had very little idea, and probably still do, about what the hell CMOS is. I was like, isn't that thing that the Dr. Obi talks about or whatever? But it's a food supplement. It's very nutritious. It's probably one of those things that could be considered a superfood. Don't, even in a gel form, don't just take a spoon and eat it, otherwise it's going to taste nasty. Most people put it in their shakes, in other food, sort of as a supplement, but it has a lot of nutritional value. And so that's how we sort of got into it. And we started, again, with the connections that we had, selling it in stores. And so we've moved to that level where we're actually selling it in stores with the branding, selling it online. And so, so for us now, it's sort of become the centerpiece of the cooperative that we've started to develop, because it's taken off so fast. And again, we think by the end of the year, we're going to have our first owner. We're going to have a commercial space, or another space that we're creating this product out of. And so it's moved pretty fast. And I will say quickly, the second thing that I think is really going to kick off for us is our security cooperative that we've also been building. And that cooperative is mixing some of our anti-police brutality work, because we're actually, as I said earlier, doing cop watches and community patrols and safety patrols in the community. And then we're starting to work with young folks, young adults, to give them training on de-escalation, weapons training, training on first aid, so that they're going to get paid for this training and to conduct the cop watches. And so what we're going to do also is that as we get that training and we get investigative skill training, actually have a security cooperative that actually, does a couple of things. One, it helps provide safety for the community. Two, it helps provide security jobs for folks that we can get certified to get security jobs, and investigative skills. And it also gives a buffer force between our community and the police. And if we get big enough, what we want to do is to create something where a board within the local community in Southwest Atlanta actually gets to say how folks get deployed in their neighborhood. So it's something that they have control of in terms of a alternative force that they're not responding to, that they don't have to take orders from, but it's actually pushing that idea of community control of the police and the demilitarization of the police, because this force is something that they will be able to control. That means they would get to sort of have a say in if someone acts out of line. It's not this whole protective agency that stops somebody from saying you can't work here anymore. They from the community get to say, like, no, you're not doing this right? And again, our job is de-escalation, so that we can get to something before it reaches a level of calling the police, or that we'll watch the police as they're doing their job, their supposed job in our community. And so that's something that we also think is going to take off and build big in the next 6 to 7 months.
Right on. Craig is speaking my language with this question here on a weed cooperative. Like, what are the thoughts on that? Like, I got my Brown Sugar University shirt on and everything. What? But seriously, like in the few things I've read, particularly up here in Maryland, it's a highly racialized, class divided industry. So it's like, here we go again. It's like, let's legalize it. And the same forces seem to be making all the money. And I can't remember the details, but up here, at least, the barrier to entry was enormous. The amount of money, the inside of the licensing, all of that. So anyway, but
No. So currently we don't have any plans to do a weed cooperative, and not because we're opposed to it. I see a disappointed face. Not because I am disappointed. It's just that we figure we have so much on the ground that we're doing in terms of cooperatives that we're developing. But I completely agree with the analysis. It's once capitalism decides that it can now make a huge profit and do it in a way that this product, which is already mass consumed, then it became easy for a lot of them at the state level to say, let's open this up. And then let's create the amount of resources you need. Your background has to be squeaky clean in a lot of places. In order to make this happen, the land resources you need to grow at a quantity that you can sell. Let's make all of that something where these corporations or these folks who are able to raise angel funding and so forth can now jump in and take control of this market, where again, for literally decades, Black folks, particularly Black youth, who've been doing this stuff to sell, to pay for things, to buy things, who've been demonized in our community, taken off the streets and used as cheap and free labor, now are still the folks who are most arrested, even at this time when they're trying to do all these supposed laws to sort of correct the past. Still are the majority of folks arrested for both selling and or using weed in different communities in different places around the country. So we know where this all leads to. This leads to another burgeoning industrial apparatus, whereas as long as the folks who are making the majority of the resources from it are white folks or folks who are already set up with the capital to do it, they're fine with making it squeaky clean for the most part. And they'll bring over their conservative cousins to it at a slow rate, but they're smart enough to know, like, this is how we set this up and this is how we keep control of it. And we'll let a couple of Black faces in because that don't hurt us, right?
I want to say it was the Koch brothers, but it may not have been them or the remaining one, but was it like it was either Koch or maybe Brookings. It was some conservative outfit has gone full in on the legalization and the business end of it. So, I mean, to your point, I mean, there's
Look at alcohol. Look, Coors is one of, like, Coors beer, it's they don't care if you get drunk or high. It's like, can I make my money off of it? But then I'm gonna punish you anyway if you do it and you try to come in my neighborhood, or if you try to mess up what we think is this sort of free enterprise system which works for us. I'll still put
the money we make, or the money that we make, we'll use to write legislation that punishes you somewhere else. So you may be, and then lastly on this point, it doesn't even change the need for the so-called underground or pun intended black market economy, because most people, if you are a regular user who is poor, you can't afford to go to a dispensary on a regular basis anyway. So you're going to have to go back to the same people because the dispensaries are so much more expensive than what it is in the street. So you're going to have to go back to those same spots anyway, who can then still be punished for the illegal activity. So listen, my man, there's so much we didn't get to, unfortunately. And I hate to say this, but I have to actually wrap up here in the hour. So let me at least give you a few minutes. Is there something that we didn't get to that you want to at least touch on? Obviously, we can easily do this as much as we want going forward, but there's so much other, we didn't get we didn't get to any of your legal career work. That was something I wanted to talk about. We got to come back and talk about just that alone, because I think, like I was saying with Kalonji, man, I think the comrades we have on this channel are very interesting people outside of the work that they're immediately known for doing now. So I think, anyway, so we'll have to do this some more later, but anything to wrap up with today?
I mean, the big thing for me is just about, just in terms of who our viewership is, the viewership of your show, the folks that we get this stuff out to. I just come back to the stuff that we started hitting on earlier, is like how important it is for us at this particular point in time to really get organized, right? To really start creating organizational apparatuses. And it doesn't necessarily have to be grassroots organizing, but again, it could be other things that we think need to happen in radical spaces and in radical ways. Because, my last words is that they're coming for us, right? We're reaching a time period in American history over the last 15, 20 years, and I think this is going to extend to another 30 or 40 years, where we're in a period where, with the demographic shifts that are happening in America, the white working class in particular is owned by the rich, right? They're owned by the elites, and those elites are looking to maintain their spots, their resources. They're looking to control folks on the ground, and folks who are on the ground, these working class white folks, are scared of losing their whatever nominal place they think they have in society. And they've been organizing themselves, and they've had the resources to do so, because folks that you mentioned, like Koch and others, have given resources to help build out like a patriot party and all that kind of stuff that they've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years. So I think we're at this sort of inflection point in the United States. And I think the next 20 years, even as these sort of conversations around police brutality and the overt sort of conservatism and white supremacy that's made its way back, is something that we have to be particularly watchful of, and start particularly building on what are the alternative apparatuses that we need in order to not only survive, right, but to fight back against what's coming down the pike and what's already been coming down the pike in terms of what's happening in our community.
Right on. Kamau K. Franklin, Community Movement Builders, co-host Renegade Culture, Black Power Media. Thanks again, man. Appreciate you, man.
Appreciate you having me. I won't talk trash. All right.
Peace. All right, everybody. Big again shout out to Kamau and Community Movement Builders. Make sure you support them. communitymovementbuilders.org. I want to thank everybody for joining me this afternoon. I think a lot of you stayed for the whole live. Those who are going to see this later on, definitely thank you as well. I'm going to check some of the comments in the chat later on and look to respond separately, because unfortunately time is just up. And I want to thank again Jamie Buell, Joshua Devine, Dedrick Muhammad from NCRC, National Coalition Reinvestment. This is just terrible. This is just terrible. From the NCRC, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Thanks to them for their discussion of Black business and economics. And again, thanks to all of you for your comments and questions and participation live and in the replay. And don't forget, even if I don't get to it right away, or if we don't get to it right away, like my man Pierre says, make sure if you got something to say,
put it in the comments.
And like Fred Hampton used to say, we say peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Thanks again. A lot of great stuff coming up on Black Power Media, including the launch of the Remix morning show tomorrow morning, 4:20, 8 a.m. Eastern. Do not miss it. And we'll see you then and catch you in that whirlwind, like Garvey says. So peace, everybody. Catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like Live.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.